Why did Dostoevsky predict the collapse of Western civilization 150 years before our time, and how are his prophecies coming true right now? The dark truth about what awaits humanity if we don't return to spiritual roots. The great writer revealed the main danger of rationalism and materialism long before the emergence of totalitarian regimes. In the Grand Inquisitor, he showed how people willingly give up freedom in exchange for security. His characters, Raskolnikov, Ivan Karamazov, the underground man, are mirrors of modern man who has lost faith and meaning. Dostoevsky understood, without God, everything is permitted, and this leads to spiritual emptiness. He saw how Western Christianity turned into a political tool while Orthodoxy preserved true spirituality. The writer warned that socialism would become a religion without God, and scientific materialism would kill the human soul. Today, his words sound prophetic. Before you watch this video, in which we will analyze Dostoevsky's entire philosophy from beginning to end, don't forget to subscribe to this channel. Let's get started. Part 1. Russian Orthodox Christianity versus Western religion. For Dostoevsky, the divide between Eastern Orthodoxy and Western Christianity was far more than a doctrinal disagreement. It was, in his eyes, a profound moral and spiritual struggle for the future of humanity. He contended that both Catholicism and Protestantism had strayed from the true essence of Christ's message. Western Christian institutions, he argued, had compromised the spiritual core of Christianity by aligning themselves with worldly ambitions, seeking political power, intellectual prestige, and societal control. In contrast, Dostoevsky believed that Russian Orthodoxy had remained faithful to the heart of Christian faith, humility, suffering, and a mystical relationship with God. This wasn't merely an expression of national loyalty. It was a deeply rooted philosophical and theological conviction that underpinned his entire worldview. His condemnation of Roman Catholicism was especially severe. He saw the Catholic Church as a continuation of the Roman Empire, more invested in authority and governance than in spiritual truth. In his view, the Church had twisted Christ's teachings by trying to establish a kingdom on earth rather than pointing souls toward the kingdom of heaven. Where love and humility should have reigned, the Church had imposed hierarchy and force. It had traded the transformative mystery of personal faith for legalistic control and intellectual systems. Bureaucracy replaced true spiritual fellowship, and theology overtook the living experience of God. To Dostoevsky, Catholicism embodied everything Christ had rejected during his temptations in the desert. The character of the Grand Inquisitor serves as Dostoevsky's symbolic critique of Catholicism. The Inquisitor, convinced of his righteousness, claims to act out of compassion by relieving humanity of the burden of spiritual freedom. He believes that people are too fragile and ignorant to make independent choices about faith. Therefore, the Church must decide on their behalf. By offering clear doctrines, authoritative structures, and freedom from doubt, the Church presents itself as a benevolent guide. Yet Dostoevsky saw this as a betrayal of Christ's core message. Freedom, however painful, is essential to true love, faith, and inner transformation. By taking it away, the Church also strips away the possibility of authentic spiritual growth. In Dostoevsky's analysis, this distortion was not an unfortunate deviation, but the inevitable outcome of Catholic theology and its institutional model. The emphasis on papal infallibility and adherence to church tradition supplanted the immediate personal communion between each believer and God. Elaborate theological frameworks replaced simple, heartfelt faith. The pursuit of wealth and political dominance further eroded the Church's original spiritual mission. What remained was a hollow version of Christianity, Christian in name, but devoid of the radical spirit that once made it a revolutionary force. Protestantism, Dostoevsky believed, took the crisis even further. By rejecting papal authority and church hierarchy, Protestants pushed Western Christianity to its final atomized form, radical individualism. The principle that each person could interpret Scripture independently led, in his view, to the collapse of any shared religious truth. If salvation depended solely on personal belief and not on communal worship, then religion became isolated, private, and ultimately insignificant to society. Protestantism, unintentionally, had laid the groundwork for secularism. By turning faith into a subjective experience, it reduced religion to a lifestyle choice and paved the way for a culture in which belief itself could be discarded. In Dostoevsky's view, Protestantism was not an endpoint, but a passage from faith to disbelief. He saw socialism as the final outcome of this spiritual decline, a synthesis of Western Christianity's deepest errors. Like Catholicism, socialism aimed to build a perfect world through external authority and societal structures. Like Protestantism, it claimed to liberate the individual, but it sought to achieve these goals by removing God altogether and enthroning human will and reason in his place. In Dostoevsky's estimation, socialism was the ultimate heresy born from the Western Christian tradition, a final attempt to bring heaven to earth through human means, bypassing divine grace. It preserved Christianity's passion for justice and equality, yet rejected the Christian understanding of sin, the need for redemption, and the mystery of divine providence. In contrast to the many deviations he perceived in Western Christianity, Dostoevsky upheld Russian Orthodoxy as the truest expression of Christian faith. Unlike the Western churches, which often sought influence through worldly power or the construction of ideal societies, Orthodoxy had remained rooted in the mystical and contemplative heart of Christianity, dimensions the West had sacrificed in its pursuit of rational theology and social authority. Orthodox Christians viewed the spiritual life not as an exercise in moral superiority or intellectual mastery, but as a journey marked by suffering, humility, and communion with God. The Church, in their understanding, was not a fortress of saints dispensing salvation, but a fellowship of sinners striving toward redemption. Their faith preserved the early Christian conviction that the world was fundamentally fallen and that true hope belonged not to this life, but to the one beyond it. For Dostoevsky, this theology of suffering lay at the center of his religious vision. While Western Christianity frequently attempted to rationalize or downplay the existence of suffering, Orthodoxy embraced it as a vital element of the spiritual path. Through suffering, believers cultivated empathy for the pain of others. It was in suffering that the ego was stripped of pride, selfishness, and illusion. In suffering, the believer participated in Christ's own passion and began to grasp the deeper mysteries of redemption. Rather than a tragic misfortune to be avoided, suffering became, in Dostoevsky's view, a sacred means of transformation and spiritual purification. This perspective was closely tied to the Orthodox doctrine of kenosis, the radical self-emptying love exemplified by Christ in his incarnation and crucifixion. True Christian love demanded the surrender of personal will and a willingness to offer oneself completely for the sake of others. This love was not a mere expression of humanitarian concern or moral obligation, but a mystical sharing in God's own boundless love for the world. Such love could not be manufactured through ethical discipline or intellectual rigor. It was a gift of grace, possible only within the context of authentic spiritual community. It required a depth of humility and self-forgetfulness that Western individualism made difficult, if not impossible, to attain. Dostoevsky brought these orthodox principles to life through characters like Alyosha Karamazov, Prince Mishkin, and Father Zosima. These figures represent the ideal of holy simplicity, a blend of profound spiritual insight and childlike purity. They do not act based on theological argument or ethical calculation. Instead, they respond to each moment with instinctive love and compassion, trusting in divine providence to work through their quiet fidelity. They are willing to bear the suffering of others and offer forgiveness, even to those guilty of grave wrongdoing. In every person, no matter how corrupt or fallen, they perceive the image of Christ. Yet Dostoevsky did not romanticize or idealize these characters. Figures like Prince Mishkin are often seen as naive or powerless by the standards of the world. Their goodness does not always bring about healing or success. In fact, their innocence sometimes becomes a source of pain, not only for themselves, but for those around them. Dostoevsky recognized that Orthodox Christianity did not promise happiness, nor did it guarantee practical results. What it offered was something far deeper, the possibility of spiritual truth and ultimate purpose in a world that so often appeared chaotic and devoid of meaning. The implications of this vision were deeply unsettling to many Western readers. If Russian Orthodoxy truly embodied Christianity, then Russia carried a divine mission to redeem the world from the spiritual decay and materialism of the West. Despite its visible hardships and historical failures, Russian civilization, in Dostoevsky's view, retained the soul of authentic Christian faith. The Russian people, regardless of their poverty or lack of sophistication, stood closer to God than the wealthy, educated societies of Western Europe. This idea merged profound spiritual insight with a perilous nationalist mythos, one that would ultimately have devastating consequences, not only for Russia, but for the world at large. Fyodor Dostoevsky envisioned the ultimate spiritual confrontation in human history as a clash between Russian orthodoxy and the secular worldview of the West. Humanity, in his view, faced a stark decision: to accept the orthodox path marked by suffering, humility, and mystical communion with God, or to continue its decline into the void of materialism, atheism, and spiritual desolation. To Dostoevsky, there was no neutral or moderate position, only one of two destinies. This existential divide, he believed, was nothing less than a choice between Christ and the Antichrist, between the divine order of God's kingdom and the man-made dominion of worldly power, between eternal salvation and spiritual ruin. Within this great metaphysical conflict, Russia, he felt, had a providential role to play. It was to serve as a redemptive nation, a suffering servant willing to carry the burden of pain and spiritual responsibility that others rejected. Dostoevsky's fusion of religious faith and national identity was both the core strength and the Achilles heel of his spiritual outlook. On one hand, it gave him remarkable insight into the spiritual hollowness of modern secular life, as well as a deep understanding of why people are drawn to both religious extremism and radical political ideologies. On the other hand, this same conviction led him to glorify Russian culture and Orthodox Christianity, often overlooking their very real flaws and historical failings. The Russia that stirred Dostoevsky's soul was less a geopolitical reality than a symbol of spiritual truth. Likewise, the orthodoxy he revered was more of an aspirational ideal than a reflection of the real, institutional church. His religious philosophy was stirring and profound, but it became potentially perilous when interpreted as a call to political action. Part 2. Love as the ultimate reality and redemptive force. At the heart of Dostoevsky's worldview lies a profound and radical belief. Love is not simply one emotion among many, nor just a facet of human psychology or social interaction. Rather, it is the essential force that binds all of existence, the deepest truth behind all appearances. Dostoevsky saw love not as the sentimental ideal glorified by popular culture, nor as the calculated goodwill promoted by ethical theorists. Instead, he viewed love as a universal and transcendent principle, revealed most powerfully in moments of suffering, self-sacrifice, and the willingness to share in the pain of others. In his philosophy, this ultimate form of love is indistinguishable from God. It is this divine capacity to love that, for Dostoevsky, makes human redemption possible. His vision of love was not born from abstract theorizing, but from personal experience, especially the profound spiritual transformation he underwent during his imprisonment in a Siberian labor camp. There, amidst the brutality and despair, he encountered acts of unexpected kindness and compassion. He witnessed hardened men risk their lives for the sake of their fellow inmates and perform acts of generosity that defied reason or self-interest. In those rare but powerful moments, Dostoevsky felt the illusion of separateness between self and other dissolve. He experienced an overwhelming sense of unity with all suffering humanity. These encounters led him to believe that beneath the cruelty and egoism so often visible in human behavior lies a deeper, hidden current of universal love capable of redeeming even the most lost souls. Yet Dostoevsky's understanding of love is marked by paradox and complexity. He believed that true love could only arise through a total acceptance of suffering. Those who tried to shield themselves or others from pain, who sought to avoid hardship in pursuit of comfort and pleasure, remained spiritually stunted. In his view, the pursuit of happiness for its own sake led only to deeper self-absorption. It was only through embracing suffering as a necessary part of spiritual awakening that individuals could move beyond the confines of ego and participate in the higher, universal love that connects all life. This kind of love often did not resemble joy or fulfillment. It frequently appeared in the form of loss, sorrow, and heartbreak. Dostoevsky explored this paradox in the lives of his characters, each revealing a different facet of love and its absence. Prince Mishkin, the protagonist of The Idiot, embodies an innocent, selfless love that seeks nothing in return. He gives freely of himself, desiring only the good of others. But this purity is not rewarded. On the contrary, it brings suffering both to him and those he tries to help. His goodness, in a world unprepared to receive it, becomes a destructive force. Yet Dostoevsky implies that Mishkin's apparent failure is, in a deeper sense, a hidden triumph. His love may not save others immediately, but it sows seeds that could one day blossom into redemption. Love may not eliminate suffering, but it can radically change its meaning and offer a glimpse of higher purpose. In contrast, Alyosha Karamazov presents a more grounded, mature embodiment of love, one shaped by realism and humility. Alyosha doesn't attempt to rescue the world through sheer idealism. Instead, he meets people where they are, offering quiet, compassionate responses suited to each particular situation. He listens with empathy, forgives without preconditions, and offers help without needing acknowledgement or reward. His love is subtle, not dramatic, yet it exerts a quiet, transformative influence on nearly everyone he meets. Through Alyosha, Dostoevsky reveals a form of love that is both entirely selfless and fully attuned to the complexities of real life. The stark contrast between characters who embody love and those who are estranged from it exposes the core tragedy of human existence. Figures such as Raskolnikov, Ivan Karamazov, and the Underground Man possess remarkable intellectual insight and emotional depth. Yet they remain imprisoned within their own subjectivity, unable to form authentic connections with others. Their brilliance becomes a kind of confinement, cutting them off from the unforced rhythm of life and love. They grasp nearly everything except the most vital truth, how to love and allow themselves to be loved. Their downfall lies not in moral depravity, but in their alienation from the wellspring of meaning and joy. For Dostoevsky, this sense of isolation represented the central crisis of modernity. The prevailing ideologies of rationalism, individualism, and materialism had conditioned people to see themselves as isolated entities, locked in competition over limited resources in a universe devoid of inherent meaning. Within such a framework, true love becomes almost inconceivable, as it rests on the belief that self-interest and altruism are fundamentally incompatible. While individuals may cooperate when mutual benefits align, they cannot love in the deepest sense unless they overcome the illusion of separateness. The result is a society that excels in technological and material advancement, yet suffers from profound spiritual emptiness, a civilization capable of incredible feats, but devoid of lasting happiness or meaning. In contrast to this bleak modern landscape, Dostoevsky offered the vision of Sobornost, a term rooted in Russian Orthodoxy that signifies spiritual unity through love. Sobornost transcends mere collaboration or civic solidarity. It is a mystical participation in divine love that unites all living beings. In the experience of Sobornost, individuals come to see that their truest interests are inseparable from those of others. They awaken to the understanding that the perceived boundaries between self and other are illusions born of the ego. Fulfillment, then, is found not in asserting the self, but in going beyond it. This awakening cannot be attained by intellectual reasoning or sheer moral determination. It is a gift of grace, accessible only within the context of authentic spiritual communion. In The Brothers Karamazov, Father Zosima exemplifies the spirit of Sobornost and stands as Dostoevsky's clearest portrayal of love's transformative power. Zosima teaches that each person bears responsibility for all humanity, and that all suffering is interconnected. When one individual commits a sin, the entire human family is wounded. When one is redeemed, all are uplifted. This interconnectedness is not an external ethical duty imposed by society, but a spiritual truth revealed to those who have learned to love without reservation. Zosima perceives the image of Christ in every person because he has moved beyond the ego's dividing lines that usually keep people isolated from one another. Yet Dostoevsky was far too perceptive a student of human nature to present love as a simple remedy for all human ills. Genuine love demands great personal sacrifice and often results in heartbreak, loss, or apparent failure. Those who love most deeply are often those who suffer most profoundly, as they willingly embrace not only their own sorrow, but the pain of others. Love does not erase evil or prevent suffering. What it does is transform the meaning of suffering and evil, placing them within a larger framework of ultimate redemption. This transformation is real and deeply significant, though it often remains hidden from those who measure life solely by conventional standards of success and failure. Dostoevsky also recognized the many ways love can be distorted or misused. Possessive love that seeks to dominate or control is not love at all. It is ego cloaked in affection. Sentimental love that avoids the truth or refuses to face painful realities is merely another form of self-gratification. Ideological love that professes devotion to humanity while neglecting the real needs of individual people becomes a dangerous form of fanaticism. True love requires discernment, bravery, and a readiness to accept the weight of one's actions. It is the hardest and most demanding task a human being can undertake, and precisely because of that, it remains an achievement that few ever fully realize. Fyodor Dostoevsky saw the highest expression of love as the ability to forgive. It is easy to offer love to those who are kind, beautiful, or seem worthy of affection. But only a person transformed by grace can extend love to an enemy, pardon those who have caused pain, and perceive the divine spark within even those who seem entirely depraved. This level of forgiveness goes far beyond a mere moral decision. Rather, it represents a profound spiritual insight that beneath all external distinctions, every human being shares the same essential nature. Those who forgive in this radical way transcend the usual boundaries of justice and injustice, stepping into a divine vision that values every soul equally and recognizes our shared need for redemption. To Dostoevsky, the ability to love and forgive in this way was the highest sign of human nobility. It answered the deepest philosophical questions about life's meaning and purpose. Those who attained this state of spiritual maturity became vessels for divine love, allowing it to flow into the world and work its quiet transformation. They could not erase suffering or resolve every human dilemma, but they could alter the spiritual climate in which such struggles took place. Their lives served as reminders of forgotten possibilities and rekindled hopes long abandoned. Through the power of their example, what once seemed unattainable became real, and glimpses of the kingdom of heaven broke through, even amidst the darkest corners of earthly existence. Part 3. The Prophecy of Totalitarianism. In the 1870s, long before fascism and communism took hold, Fyodor Dostoevsky foresaw with remarkable clarity the methods and mass appeal of totalitarian movements. Through his novel Demons, He envisioned a world of revolutionary violence that eerily mirrored the strategies and mindset of the extremist ideologies that would dominate the 20th century. Yet, Dostoevsky's vision went far beyond political forecasting. He grasped the deeper psychological and spiritual conditions that would give rise to totalitarian regimes. He recognized that modern society was inevitably drifting toward new, more insidious forms of tyranny. Despite the depth of his insight, his contemporaries largely dismissed his political writings, accusing him of reacting hysterically to what they saw as trivial social unrest. History would prove Dostoevsky right. What made his political foresight so powerful was his realization that totalitarianism does not arise from old-style authoritarianism, but rather from the breakdown of traditional values and institutions. Classical autocrats justified their power through divine sanction, hereditary rule, or military dominance. They governed through coercion and intimidation, but typically did not aim to dominate every corner of personal life or reinvent human nature itself. Modern totalitarianism, by contrast, grows out of democratic and egalitarian ideologies that claim to champion the will of the people and the progress of history. Such leaders present themselves not as tyrants, but as benevolent agents of human liberation. They claim to be builders of utopias, working to abolish suffering and create a flawless society. This makes their rule far more perilous than that of traditional despots, because it cloaks oppression in the language of morality and progress, making it far harder to challenge or resist. Dostoevsky understood that this new brand of tyranny would be rooted in philosophical trends, then sweeping through European intellectual circles. Materialism, for example, reduced human beings to mere biological mechanisms, governed entirely by physical and social forces. If this were true, then human behavior could be scientifically engineered by manipulating the surrounding environment. Rationalism insisted that reason alone could solve all social problems and construct ideal institutions. If this were the case, then those who possessed the most rational insight would not only feel entitled, but obligated to impose their designs on the rest of society. Meanwhile, atheism argued that moral truths were not fixed or divine, but human inventions. If morals were just social constructs, then they could be altered at will to serve political aims. Together, these philosophies laid the groundwork for totalitarian ideologies. If people were nothing more than complex machines, then they had no intrinsic dignity or rights to protect them from being exploited in the name of social engineering. If reason alone was the source of authority, then intellectual elites could override the customs and preferences of the majority. And if morality was fluid and subjective, then virtually any action, even atrocities, could be justified so long as it aligned with the movement's goals. What appeared to 19th century liberals as enlightened and humane ideas in fact contained within them the potential for immense cruelty and oppression. In Demons, Dostoevsky dramatized how these abstract theories would be put into practice. The novel's radicals begin with authentic concerns about injustice and a heartfelt desire to uplift the downtrodden. However, their obsession with ideological purity eventually consumes their empathy and corrupts their moral judgment. They come to believe that lying, stealing, and even killing are justified if done in service of their cause, having convinced themselves that their own emotions and moral hesitations are hindrances to a greater collective goal. They construct sophisticated ideological rationalizations for behaviors that, prior to their conversion, they would have recognized as undeniably evil. This gives rise to a form of evil far more insidious than ordinary criminality, because it acts with a clean conscience and cloaks itself in the language of moral righteousness. Fyodor Dostoevsky grasped that this type of ideological zealotry would hold particular appeal for young intellectuals who had abandoned traditional religious belief but still craved meaning and purpose. Revolutionary ideologies filled this void, offering a sense of mission and existential significance that secular life could not. Through participation in world-changing movements, they felt their lives gained profound importance. By aligning themselves with what they saw as the unstoppable tide of historical progress, they believed they were part of a cosmic struggle between good and evil, and on the side destined to prevail. Ideologies that claimed to explain every facet of existence and promised ultimate solutions provided refuge from the ambiguity and moral confusion of modern life. For many, revolutionary doctrines became replacements for the religious faith they had lost. However, Dostoevsky also foresaw that these revolutionary movements would ultimately betray their own principles and devolve into tyranny. The same doctrines that legitimized the violent overthrow of the existing order would, in time, justify oppressive control over the new one. If humans were merely rational entities, they could be engineered to serve the collective good. If long-standing moral norms were seen as impediments to progress, then re-educating the population to embrace new values would be essential. If individual desires clashed with the needs of the collective, then those desires would have to be suppressed. The logic that once justified revolution would inevitably evolve into a rationale for authoritarian rule once the revolutionaries seized power. In Demons, the character Shigalov illustrates this transformation from utopian idealism to authoritarian planning. He begins with the noble aim of achieving absolute equality and freedom for all. Yet, as he carries his ideas to their logical conclusion, he finds that genuine equality demands the total eradication of personal liberty. His envisioned utopia divides society into two distinct classes: a privileged minority that holds all decision-making power, and a majority condemned to a life of uniformity and complete obedience. Shigalov presents this not as a distortion of his ideals, but as their necessary realization. In his view, true freedom and equality can only emerge through the elimination of the deceptive versions that enable inequality and domination. This contradiction lies at the heart of all totalitarian ideologies. They promise freedom but deliver subjugation. They claim to act in the people's name, yet reduce individuals to mere instruments in their grand social experiments. They begin with humanitarian rhetoric, but commit horrors that eclipse those of historical despots. These are not unfortunate deviations from well-meaning goals. They are the inevitable consequences of the underlying philosophy. Any political ideology that rejects the inherent dignity of the individual, denies universal moral truths, and disregards the mystery and depth of human nature is destined to culminate in tyranny. Dostoevsky also anticipated that such regimes would use terror not just as a means of gaining or keeping power, but as a deliberate strategy to reshape human consciousness. The purpose of terror is to dismantle traditional moral frameworks and social ties that might resist ideological control. In a climate of constant fear, where anyone might be denounced and punished, people are coerced into submission, their capacity for independent thought and moral judgment gradually destroyed. People living under totalitarian regimes gradually learn to silence their own thoughts and emotions, adopting whatever beliefs and behaviors the system demands. Over time, they develop a psychological reliance on the very structure that oppresses them, as it becomes their sole source of stability and purpose in an otherwise shattered existence. The use of terror goes far beyond enforcing outward obedience. It infiltrates the inner world of its victims, warping their consciousness in such a way that true resistance becomes nearly unthinkable. Some of the novel's most unsettling moments portray the psychological dismantling of those who initially resist the revolutionary cause. These individuals are not merely imprisoned or eliminated. Instead, they are methodically broken through a ruthless combination of ideological coercion, enforced isolation, and calculated psychological torment. Their defiance isn't overcome by logical persuasion, but by the systematic erasure of their ability to think independently or to make moral choices. What remains is no longer a person in rebellion, but a tool shaped to serve the movement's ends. This process eerily foreshadows the advanced psychological control tactics later employed by totalitarian regimes in the 20th century. Yet, Dostoevsky's most striking insight lies in his recognition of the religious character embedded within totalitarian ideologies. These systems are not merely political constructs, they function as substitute religions, presenting a unified worldview that claims to explain all of life's complexities while promising an ultimate form of salvation. They require more than passive obedience. They demand sincere belief and passionate devotion to their sacred cause. Such movements craft their own sacred rituals, honor martyrs, and produce doctrinal texts, all mirroring the structure of traditional religious institutions. They offer their followers a kind of symbolic immortality, achieved through complete identification with the movement and its seemingly eternal objectives. It is this religious quality that grants totalitarianism a depth and resilience far beyond that of ordinary political despotism. These regimes are able to tap into profound spiritual longings that secular societies often fail to satisfy. For Dostoevsky, the deepest horror of totalitarianism lies not in the suffering it causes, but in its power to make people content with their suffering. By eradicating the capacity for independent thought and genuine emotional experience, such systems produce citizens who truly believe that their bondage is a form of liberty, and that their dehumanization is a kind of noble duty. They are no longer able to conceive of a different life, nor to imagine what true freedom might look like. Rebellion becomes psychologically impossible. This marks the ultimate triumph of evil, not simply the destruction of goodness, but the obliteration of its memory. It is the complete realization of the grand Inquisitor's world, where Christ's vision of freedom and love is entirely eclipsed. Part 4. The Rise of Existentialism and the Fractured Self. Well before existentialism was formally recognized as a philosophical movement, Dostoevsky had already uncovered and dramatized its essential themes. Through figures like the underground man, Raskolnikov, and members of the Karamazov family, he examined questions that would later define existentialist philosophy, such as the absurdity of life, the heavy weight of personal freedom, the dread that accompanies moral choice, and the quest for genuine identity in a world devoid of inherent meaning. However, Dostoevsky's form of existentialism stood apart from the more secular versions that would take shape in the 20th century. Rather than dismissing spiritual possibilities altogether, his work was deeply rooted in a spiritual crisis, an inner struggle that pointed not to nihilism, but to a longing for transcendence. In his view, facing the void was not the final destination, but the beginning of a more profound pursuit of higher meaning. The character of the underground man is arguably literature's first complete existential anti-hero. He recognizes with painful clarity that his existence is not defined by any preordained essence. He understands that he is entirely free to choose his own identity, but he also perceives that this radical freedom comes with unbearable responsibility, one that most individuals instinctively try to avoid. To him, all systems of morality, all institutions and values are mere human inventions, arbitrary and lacking in objective grounding. He also sees that reason, often revered as humanity's guiding light, offers no ultimate answers. It is simply another human construct devoid of divine authority or absolute truth. These realizations precede many of the core ideas that existential philosophers would articulate decades later. Yet, the underground man's response to these revelations is markedly distinct from those of later existentialists. Rather than embracing his freedom and forging his own path, he is overwhelmed by it. Instead of creating meaning in the face of meaninglessness, he spirals into isolation, bitterness, and self-sabotage. While existentialist thinkers would often advocate for authenticity through the courageous acceptance of uncertainty and freedom, the underground man recoils from this challenge, surrendering instead to spite and despair. His tragic descent illustrates the peril of existential insight divorced from any spiritual foundation. In a universe stripped of God or any external source of value, the freedom that existentialism offers turns into a torment rather than a liberation. Dostoevsky's portrayal of the divided self was equally groundbreaking and deeply influential. His characters are not coherent, unified beings. Rather, they are arenas of internal conflict, torn between competing desires, ideas, and impulses. Raskolnikov embodies both saintliness and savagery, and his decisions reflect the temporary dominance of one inner force over another. Ivan Karamazov simultaneously holds the capacity for deep religious vision and vehement theological rebellion, making him both a believer and a heretic. The underground man is at once a brilliant critic of society and a tragic figure unable to live by the insights he proclaims. Through these characters, Dostoevsky anticipates the modern psychological view that the self is not singular and stable, but fractured and in constant conflict. This fragmentation gives rise to what would later be identified by existentialists as problems of authenticity. When our inner world is divided, which aspect constitutes the true self? When our expressed ideals are at odds with our unconscious motives and real behavior, which should we believe? And if we are capable of observing our own thoughts and emotions, who exactly is the observer, and who is being observed? Such dilemmas haunt Dostoevsky's characters, pushing them toward desperate efforts to forge a sense of wholeness and unity. Yet these efforts are often doomed, as the very nature of human consciousness seems to resist integration. The self, in Dostoevsky's vision, is not a finished product, but a battleground, perpetually unsettled, forever reaching toward a coherence that may never fully arrive. Dostoevsky grasped that a divided inner life was both a curse and a gift. The very self-awareness that complicates sincere action also opens the door to moral evolution. The same inner scrutiny that can paralyze us with anxiety is what makes true self-understanding and repentance possible. The human capacity for freedom, which permits evil choices, also permits the deliberate pursuit of good. This internal split is the cost of being human, but it's also what enables real humanity to emerge. If we lacked the ability to step outside ourselves and reflect on our own behaviors and thoughts, we would be indistinguishable from animals driven solely by instinct. Dostoevsky's exploration of existence also anticipates what would later be described as bad faith, the inclination to reject one's own freedom and accountability by claiming to be controlled by external circumstances. Many of his characters attempt to evade the weight of choice by convincing themselves that their actions are dictated by their environment, psychological traits, or philosophical doctrines. Raskolnikov, for instance, rationalizes his act of murder by invoking a theory about extraordinary individuals being above the law. In truth, this is a way to avoid owning the reality that he freely chose to kill. Similarly, the underground man attributes his suffering to societal conditions and deterministic psychology. But this, too, is a mask for his unwillingness to take meaningful steps to change his life. Through these figures, Dostoevsky illustrates how easily intellectual sophistication can be weaponized to escape authentic moral responsibility. Yet, he also presents characters who achieve what existentialist philosophy calls authentic existence, a life lived with full acceptance of one's freedom and accountability. Alyosha Karamazov, for example, refuses to deflect responsibility onto external structures or deterministic ideologies. Instead, he embraces the consequences of his actions, while remaining open to spiritual influence and grace that come from beyond the self. Sonia Marmeladova, in Crime and Punishment, also exemplifies this existential authenticity. She consciously chooses to sacrifice her own well-being for the sake of her family, all the while upholding her moral integrity and human dignity. These characters prove that authenticity is attainable, but it demands profound inner courage and spiritual resilience. It is not the result of intellectual reasoning alone. Rather, it requires a deep existential shift in how one relates to life itself. This existential thread is most apparent in Dostoevsky's treatment of death and human mortality. His characters live with the constant awareness that death is inevitable, a truth that renders all worldly efforts ultimately insignificant on a cosmic scale. This awareness brings with it both existential anxiety and a sense of urgency. If life is fleeting and death unavoidable, then every decision becomes critically important, since there may never be a second chance. On the other hand, if death reduces all things to nothing, then no decision truly matters, because all paths end in the same place. This paradox fuels the existential crisis at the heart of much of Dostoevsky's psychological drama. Prince Mishkin in The Idiot represents a distinct response to this dilemma. His epileptic seizures give him what he believes is a direct encounter with a timeless, eternal reality that lies beyond death. This profound experience enables him to live with unmatched sincerity and presence, knowing that ordinary time is not the whole of existence. However, this insight also alienates him from everyday life, as he finds it difficult to take seriously the concerns that dominate most people's lives. Mishkin symbolizes both the potential and the cost of moving beyond the conventional human condition. His deeply authentic way of being comes at the expense of practical function and the possibility of ordinary happiness. Dostoevsky exerted a profound, though frequently unacknowledged influence on the development of existentialist thought. Søren Kierkegaard, often regarded as the founding figure of existentialism, was notably impacted by Dostoevsky's probing examinations of anxiety, despair, and the necessity of a leap of faith. Friedrich Nietzsche's idea of the Übermensch, along with his critique of traditional moral frameworks, finds clear echoes in Dostoevsky's characters such as Raskolnikov and Ivan Karamazov. Jean-Paul Sartre's exploration of self-deception and the existential weight of freedom appears deeply indebted to themes Dostoevsky had already dramatized decades earlier. Albert Camus' philosophical reflections on the absurd and his portrayal of the rebel show unmistakable traces of characters like the underground man and, at times, Ivan Karamazov. Even Martin Heidegger's inquiries into authentic existence and the concept of being toward death resonate with psychological motifs that Dostoevsky wove into his narratives, though he expressed them through fiction rather than philosophical discourse. What sets Dostoevsky apart from most existentialist thinkers of the 20th century is the fundamentally different direction his existentialism takes, one that remains open to religious and spiritual dimensions. While later existentialists often presumed that belief in God was obsolete and that individuals must generate meaning solely through their own will, Dostoevsky saw the encounter with meaninglessness as an essential gateway to a profound and sincere faith. The characters in his novels who attain true self-awareness and authenticity do not do so by denying all higher or transcendent realities. Rather, they pass through suffering and despair to arrive at a deeper spiritual clarity. In Dostoevsky's view, facing the harsh truths of the human condition with existential integrity was not a rejection of faith, but a prerequisite for embracing it, serving as a bulwark against falling into the abyss of nihilism. This spiritual foundation imbues Dostoevsky's existentialism with a sense of hope and compassion that distinguishes his work from much of the existential literature that came after him. His vision is ultimately more life-affirming and humane, grounded in the possibility of redemption through faith. Part 5. The Sacred Ground of Human Freedom. For Dostoevsky, freedom is not merely a political ideal. It isn't defined by democratic rights, legal safeguards, or economic arrangements. Rather, it forms the metaphysical core of what it means to be human. It is the essential distinction between human beings and animals, machines, and even angels. This freedom is humanity's most sacred and dreadful endowment. It is the wellspring of both our noblest achievements and our most harrowing suffering. To truly grasp Dostoevsky's vision of freedom, one must first understand what he means by the term. In everyday language, freedom is often equated with the ability to act without restraint, to do as one pleases. Most conceive of it as liberation from external control. But Dostoevsky speaks of something far deeper and far more unsettling. His idea of freedom is rooted in our capacity to choose between moral opposites, between good and evil. It is the capacity to act against reason, against self-preservation, the power to bring ruin upon oneself and others without justification. It is the possibility of rejecting God, of refusing joy, of turning away from love, from meaning, from life itself. And this freedom is not optional. We cannot relinquish it, not truly. Even when we appear to hand it over to religious authorities, political ideologies, or social systems, we are still exercising our freedom in that very act of submission. Even when we claim to be controlled by biology, upbringing, or subconscious impulses, it is still a conscious acceptance of those frameworks as explanations. Freedom shadows us constantly. It is present in every decision we make, no matter how trivial or automatic it may seem. We are inescapably free, and this inescapability lies at the heart of our anxiety, our guilt, and the existential dread that pervades human life. Why would anyone wish for such an agonizing gift? Why would a benevolent God impose such an immense burden on His creation? Because without this radical freedom, moral goodness would have no meaning. A machine that performs helpful tasks is not morally admirable. An animal protecting its offspring through instinct is not demonstrating virtue. Only a being capable of evil who deliberately chooses good can be praised for moral strength. Only someone with the power to deny love, yet who embraces it willingly, experiences authentic love. Only a soul capable of despair, yet who chooses to hope, demonstrates true courage. And here is where Dostoevsky's insight becomes most provocative. He argues that the vast majority of people cannot bear such freedom. It is simply too terrifying, too heavy a weight to carry. Faced with the full force of their freedom, most people flee from it. They hand over their autonomy to leaders who offer security and order. They cling to dogmatic systems that dictate exactly how they should think, feel, and act. They lose themselves in endless distraction, in addiction, in the pursuit of shallow pleasure. They will chase anything that spares them from the agonizing obligation of defining themselves, of choosing who they truly want to become. This is the heart of the human tragedy. The very thing that defines our humanity is what we most anxiously try to avoid. We crave freedom, yet shrink from its demands. We want the power to choose, but dread the responsibility of living with the results. We long to be virtuous, but recoil from the battle against our darker impulses. We hunger for love, yet we fear the vulnerability that love inevitably demands. Dostoevsky conveys this deep tragedy through the character of the underground man, one of literature's most significant and enduring figures. A retired civil servant turned recluse, the underground man isolates himself from society and spends his days penning venomous reflections on the human condition. He is intellectually gifted, painfully self-aware, and utterly discontent. Though he fully grasps what actions might improve his situation, he willfully avoids them. Instead, he undermines his own chances at happiness, shatters his personal connections, and deliberately immerses himself in despair. Why? Because this suffering is the only means by which he feels he can assert his autonomy. His misery becomes a defiant declaration. He is not an automaton built for contentment. He would rather endure torment as a free agent than experience joy as a passive instrument. This captures what Dostoevsky saw as a fundamental perversity in human nature. When forced to choose between imposed happiness and self-chosen suffering, We may choose the latter simply to affirm our agency. People will act irrationally, even against their own best interests, just to prove they are not reducible to algorithms or predictability. Irrationality becomes a form of protest. It is a rebellion against any ideology or system that attempts to confine human beings to rational calculations. We are willing to descend into suffering, even destruction, if doing so affirms that the choice is ours. We would rather walk into hell by our own volition than be escorted into paradise without consent. This idea carries immense weight across fields like politics, psychology, religion, and beyond. Any system that attempts to improve humanity by removing individual choice is doomed to fail. Ideologies that claim to guarantee happiness by eliminating the possibility of suffering inevitably provoke resistance and alienation. Political theories that treat humans as purely self-interested, logical decision-makers are consistently blindsided by our capacity for self-sabotage. Psychological models that seek to explain all human behavior through determinism miss the vital, irreducible force of human freedom. Yet, Dostoevsky's insight isn't confined to the destructive dimension of freedom. He also reveals what it looks like when human liberty is oriented toward love, not defiance. Characters such as Alyosha Karamazov and Prince Mishkin embody this possibility. They choose, of their own free will, to be kind, compassionate, and selfless. Far from being naive or fragile, they are fully awake to the cruelty of the world and the weight of despair. They are not oblivious to evil or untouched by the pain of existence. On the contrary, they understand it deeply, but respond with love nonetheless. Their choices aren't dictated by biology, upbringing, or social environment. They emerge from a place beyond causality, the sovereign will of the individual. Their goodness is chosen, not inherited. This higher form of freedom is not easily attained. It demands immense inner strength, unwavering moral clarity, and a readiness to endure suffering. It cannot be instilled by law, education, or programming. It must arise voluntarily within each person's soul, and it must be reaffirmed consciously and continuously across the span of a lifetime. For Dostoevsky, this is why freedom is ultimately a spiritual reality, rather than merely a political or psychological concept. True liberty is not found in the mere absence of restrictions, but in the inner power to act with grace. It is the freedom to love without reciprocity, to forgive without justification, and to cling to hope in the face of despair. But this path toward authentic freedom is paved with suffering, and this perhaps is the most difficult aspect of Dostoevsky's thought for modern audiences to accept. In a culture that seeks to eradicate suffering through medicine, therapy, and social reform, his view can seem archaic or even cruel. Yet Dostoevsky insists that suffering often serves as the crucible in which genuine freedom is forged. Pain dismantles our illusions of control and independence, forcing us to confront the ultimate questions of meaning and purpose. It tears down the masks we wear and reveals the core of who we are. It cultivates empathy and solidarity with others in pain. And through it, our hearts are open to redemption and renewal. Without suffering, Dostoevsky believed, we remain spiritually stunted, unable to love deeply or choose freely in any real sense. This, in the end, is the paradox at the heart of Dostoevsky's vision. Only through suffering can we discover the capacity for true love, true choice, and true humanity. Part 6. The Underground Mind and the Modern Psyche. In 1864, Dostoevsky introduced a character who would come to embody the existential alienation at the core of modern life. The underground man is not merely a fictional persona. He is a profound foreshadowing of how human awareness would evolve in an age of introspection and doubt. He stands as literature's first thoroughly self-aware neurotic, a mirror to the fractured consciousness of the contemporary individual. Here is a man whose intellect has turned inward with such intensity that it cripples him. His acute self-awareness doesn't empower him, it debilitates him. To understand the underground man is to grasp the psychological reality of countless individuals today who find themselves immobilized by their own inner complexity. His confession opens with words that have resonated through the corridors of philosophical and psychological thought for over 150 years. He identifies himself as ill, vindictive, and repulsive, not as a form of self-pity or exaggeration, but as a clinical articulation of a new psychological state emerging in modernity. His sickness is rooted in an overwhelming consciousness. His spite is the product of a mind that sees the hollowness of existence. His ugliness stems from a mental hyperactivity that severs him from the simplicity of human intimacy. At the heart of his suffering lies an excess of thought. In previous eras, people could rely on instinct, inherited customs, or religious certainty. They could act without being ensnared by endless inner debates. But the underground man has been shaped by modern schooling, rational inquiry, and philosophical skepticism. He cannot simply believe, he must dissect. He cannot follow an impulse, he must scrutinize it. Every decision he contemplates is smothered by a storm of internal objections. What we now term analysis paralysis was already diagnosed by Dostoevsky long before psychology gave it a name. This mental overactivity doesn't lead to clarity. It renders action almost impossible. He's fully aware of what steps he could take to improve his condition. Yet awareness does not translate into action. He knows exercise would benefit him, but dissects his motivations until the urge fades. He craves social contact, yet imagines every awkward moment in advance until he convinces himself to stay inside. He dreams of pursuing meaningful goals, yet interrogates the value of all pursuits until he is consumed by despair. The very intelligence that should elevate him instead becomes the chain that binds him. However, his dilemma is not limited to overthinking. He also suffers from a numbing of authentic emotion. Every feeling that arises is immediately passed through a gauntlet of internal filters, scrutinized, questioned, and deconstructed, until the original emotion is warped beyond recognition. When anger surges within him, he does not express it. Instead, he interrogates it. Is it justified? What will others think? What deeper issue does it mask? By the end of this process, the anger has metastasized into something else entirely, most often into shame, self-loathing, or a toxic blend of the two. His emotional responses are never direct. They are overanalyzed until they lose their original shape and meaning. This detachment from his own feelings leaves him estranged from himself. He observes his internal life like an outsider, as if his own mind belonged to someone else. One part of his consciousness monitors and criticizes the rest, leading to a state of internal conflict. He is split in two, simultaneously the observer and the observed, making any genuine expression of self feel contrived or hollow. Every word he speaks, every move he makes, carries the weight of excessive deliberation. Nothing feels natural or sincere because it has passed through too many layers of internal judgment. In today's terms, we might describe him as suffering from severe social anxiety. But Dostoevsky identified this condition long before it had a clinical name. The underground man longs for connection with others, yet his relentless self-awareness makes social engagement unbearable. The moment he steps into a room, his mind begins scanning the faces around him, obsessing over how he is being perceived, dissecting every interaction before it even unfolds. He scrutinizes every facial expression, every inflection in a voice, and every subtle gesture, interpreting them all as signs of disdain or dismissal. His obsession with how others perceive him becomes so overwhelming that he loses the ability to engage authentically. Conversations, rather than flowing naturally, become strained and artificial, as he is more focused on self-surveillance than true interaction. This overwhelming social anxiety traps him in a self-reinforcing cycle of isolation. Feeling ill at ease around others, he begins to withdraw. Yet the more he withdraws, the more uncomfortable he feels in the rare moments he does seek connection. Eventually, he constructs elaborate rationalizations, convincing himself that others are beneath him and that solitude is not only preferable but superior to human companionship. These justifications are, in truth, psychological shields, defensive narratives crafted to preserve his fragile self-image. But he persuades himself that they are deep philosophical truths. What began as emotional wounds are rebranded as intellectual convictions. The underground man also embodies what modern psychology would term cognitive dissonance, the state of holding contradictory thoughts and desires at once. This inner friction fuels erratic and irrational behaviors. Though he claims to revere logic above all else, his actions frequently defy reason. He insists on being left in peace, yet seethes with anger when others ignore him. He proclaims a hatred for society, yet craves validation from it. He declares himself free from traditional moral codes, only to agonize over insignificant ethical lapses. These internal contradictions are not incidental or fleeting. They are woven into the very fabric of his consciousness. Educated to uphold reason, individualism, and materialist science, he finds himself emotionally and spiritually malnourished. Human beings are not creatures of pure logic, and such ideologies fail to fulfill their deeper existential needs. The result is an ongoing inner battle between what he believes he ought to value and what he actually longs for. His intellect has been shaped by modern thinking, but his heart still hungers for meaning, intimacy, and something beyond the self. Dostoevsky reveals that this tension gives rise to a uniquely modern form of suffering. In the past, human pain was rooted in tangible hardships, poverty, illness, war, or disaster. Though devastating, these struggles were understandable and shared. The underground man, however, suffers from something far more elusive and isolating. He suffers from an inability to believe deeply in anything, to feel without hesitation, or to connect with others in an unguarded way. He endures the loss of purpose, of emotion in its purest form and of meaning itself. This is the anguish of modern alienation, more corrosive than physical suffering because it strikes at the soul's foundation and renders life itself hollow. His reaction to this inner torment is both pitiable and strangely visionary. Deprived of real connection or purpose, he begins to cultivate his suffering deliberately, treating it as if it were a form of artistic expression. He spins complex arguments to assert that suffering holds more value than happiness. He comes to believe that his alienation reflects a heightened sensitivity and superior intellect. In doing so, he turns his psychological distress into a source of pride. This dynamic would later echo through many 20th century intellectual movements, from existentialism and postmodernism to strands of identity politics. When people can no longer find meaning in love, truth, or beauty, they often begin to find it in their wounds, in their estrangement, or in their defiance of societal norms. But Dostoevsky goes beyond merely diagnosing the malaise of modern consciousness. He also gestures toward a remedy, though it demands deep inner transformation. The underground man's suffering is rooted in his overdependence on rational thought and his detachment from the deeper wellsprings of life. He has become estranged from his innate capacities for faith, love, and transcendence. These lost capacities cannot be restored through more thinking or improved therapeutic methods. What is required is a complete shift of the soul, a turning away from ego-centered analysis and toward something larger than the self. He must learn to pause the endless self-examination long enough to truly live, to lower his emotional defenses enough to love, and to surrender his obsession with autonomy in order to rediscover the sacred, the transcendent, the enduring. This is why Dostoevsky saw the crisis at the heart of modern consciousness not merely as psychological or societal, but as fundamentally spiritual in nature. The troubles of the underground man could not be resolved through therapy, education, or social progress. What he required was nothing less than a radical reorientation of his entire way of being, an awakening to a different mode of existence. He needed to reclaim a sense of awe, a capacity for reverence, and the ability to form authentic, meaningful connections with others. However, such a transformation could not be accomplished by sheer force of will or intellectual striving. It demanded something deeper, an experience of grace. And grace, Dostoevsky believed, comes only to those who recognize their own powerlessness and willingly open themselves to the possibility of redemption. Part 7. The Revolt Against Rationalism and Scientific Materialism. Dostoevsky, observing the dominant intellectual movements of his era, believed he was witnessing humanity's rapid march toward spiritual ruin. The 19th century was marked by an unwavering faith in scientific advancement, rational enlightenment, and the promise of utopian social engineering. Across Europe, intellectuals were convinced that human reason could solve all of life's problems. They envisioned a future in which science would replace religion, education would dispel ignorance, and carefully designed social systems would eradicate poverty, crime, and violence. To the educated classes of the time, these ideals seemed both logical and morally progressive. But to Dostoevsky, they were seductive illusions, ideologies that, if followed, would unleash immense human suffering. At the heart of rationalism's failure, according to Dostoevsky, lies a flawed understanding of what it means to be human. Rationalist thinkers presume that people are fundamentally logical beings who make choices by calculating what best serves their interests. If someone behaves self-destructively or irrationally, the assumption is that they simply lack education or have been shaped by unhealthy social environments. Improve these conditions, the rationalist believes, and human behavior will improve in turn. On the surface, this appears to be a compassionate and reasonable view, but Dostoevsky saw it as a disastrous misreading of the human soul. Human beings, he argued, are not governed primarily by reason. We are emotional, spiritual, and often deeply irrational creatures, driven by impulses that defy logic. We regularly act against our own interests for reasons that have more to do with pride, pain, or inner turmoil than with rational thought. At times, we embrace suffering because it feels more genuine than a happiness that seems artificial. We resist sound advice not because we don't understand it, but because accepting it means admitting vulnerability. We sometimes engage in harmful behaviors simply because they offer a fleeting sense of control or independence. And often, we act without even understanding why, compelled by subconscious urges far beyond our rational grasp. This theme appears again and again in Dostoevsky's novels. In Crime and Punishment, Raskolnikov commits murder, not because it aligns with his interests, but to test whether he is above moral law. In Notes from Underground, the protagonist deliberately sabotages his own well-being, not due to ignorance, but because choosing suffering is his only way to affirm his free will. In The Brothers Karamazov, Ivan constructs rigorous arguments against the existence of God, not because logic demands it, but because he cannot emotionally reconcile the existence of innocent suffering with a benevolent deity. In every case, the character's actions arise from deep psychological needs that reason alone cannot explain. This understanding of human nature carries troubling implications for all utopian ideologies. If people do not act in rational ways, then no amount of rational social planning can ever produce a perfect society. If much of human behavior is shaped by unconscious emotional forces, then education and reform will always be limited in their effectiveness. If individuals sometimes choose suffering over happiness for existential reasons, then material progress alone can never ensure fulfillment or peace. Rationalist reformers, Dostoevsky believed, are trying to solve the human dilemma with tools that are simply not fit for the task. Their efforts are akin to a surgeon attempting to cure depression with a scalpel, or an engineer trying to design love with equations. But Dostoevsky's critique does not stop at pointing out the futility of rationalism. It goes further, suggesting that an overdependence on reason can actually deepen the crisis of the human spirit. When individuals attempt to live according to pure rationality, they estrange themselves from their own emotional and spiritual depths. Like the underground man, they become trapped in endless self-analysis, disconnected from real feeling, and incapable of forming meaningful relationships. In the end, they become cut off from the very things that give life beauty and significance, mystery, wonder, love, and transcendence. Far from offering a cure, rationalism drains life of its richness. It does not elevate the human condition. It reduces it to something lifeless and mechanical. Scientific materialism introduces a host of troubling consequences. When individuals begin to see themselves merely as sophisticated biological machines operating under the laws of physics and chemistry, they risk losing their sense of intrinsic worth and moral responsibility. If every aspect of human behavior can be attributed to genetics, neural activity, or social conditioning, then ideas such as free will, ethical choice, and personal responsibility lose their relevance. Why should someone feel remorse for their actions if those actions were predetermined by factors beyond their control? What motivation is there to pursue moral growth if morality itself is merely a product of social invention, lacking any objective foundation? And what reason would anyone have to deny immediate gratification for the sake of higher ideals, if no such ideals truly exist? Only a clash of instinctual drives and societal expectations. Fyodor Dostoevsky foresaw that unchecked scientific materialism would ultimately culminate in nihilism, the belief that life lacks inherent meaning or value. If human beings are nothing more than chance outcomes of blind evolutionary mechanisms, then our existence has no built-in purpose or worth. If consciousness is merely a byproduct of brain chemistry, then our most profound emotions and thoughts are reducible to chemical processes in the brain. If morality is nothing more than a tool that evolved to ensure group cohesion and survival, it loses any claim to binding authority over individual behavior. The ultimate implication of scientific materialism is that life itself is fundamentally absurd, and all human effort is, at its core, devoid of lasting meaning. For sensitive souls, this realization leads to existential despair. For others, it fuels a cold pursuit of power, pleasure, and self-interest. The political consequences of such a worldview are deeply alarming. In a world where no objective moral truths exist, power becomes the only standard. Those who can rule. If human beings lack inherent dignity, they can be manipulated, used, or discarded without a flicker of conscience. When long-standing moral norms are dismissed as arbitrary social constructs, they can be easily dismantled and replaced by whatever ideology best serves the ruling class. If reason alone is seen as the ultimate authority, then intellectual elites may feel justified in imposing their rational designs on the broader population, regardless of public will or belief. Dostoevsky understood that this dangerous fusion of rationalism and nihilism would eventually give rise to totalitarian systems in which individuals are treated as raw material to be reshaped by ideological agendas. His fiction is populated by characters who exemplify this perilous ideology. Raskolnikov, in Crime and Punishment, believes that extraordinary people are entitled to override moral law in pursuit of supposedly rational goals. The figures in Demons, also known as the devils or the possessed, commit acts of violence and terror to advance revolutionary ideals. In The Brothers Karamazov, the Grand Inquisitor contends that the masses are incapable of handling freedom and must be governed by a select, enlightened few. In all these instances, seemingly rational justifications are used to defend behavior that is fundamentally irrational and immoral. The characters persuade themselves that they are advancing noble causes, but in reality they are often fulfilling personal desires for dominance, validation, or vengeance against a world they perceive as hostile or indifferent. Dostoevsky also recognized that neither rationalism nor materialism could ever fulfill the most profound human longings. People crave meaning, beauty, love, purpose, and transcendence. They need to feel that their lives matter on a deeper level. They must believe that their moral decisions are significant and not just the outcome of chemical or social processes. They yearn for a sense of awe, reverence, and connection to something greater than themselves. However, rationalist and materialist worldviews are inherently unable to satisfy these spiritual needs, as they either deny the existence of such realities or reduce them to illusions. A philosophy that reduces everything to physical processes cannot adequately explain consciousness, love, beauty, or moral responsibility. It leaves individuals spiritually famished, even amid material wealth and technological advancement. This kind of spiritual emptiness drives people to seek out substitutes to fill the void. Some become entranced by constant pleasure-seeking, thrill-chasing, or the pursuit of new experiences. Others throw themselves into careers, achievements, or the accumulation of money and status. Still others turn to sweeping political ideologies that promise to infuse their lives with purpose by aligning them with grand historical narratives. No substitute can truly fulfill the human longing for a deeper, transcendent purpose. While such alternatives may offer fleeting relief from a sense of emptiness, they fall short of addressing the profound spiritual void left by the dominance of rationalism and materialism. Dostoevsky did not propose irrationality or disdain for intellect as a counter to rationalism. A deeply educated and intellectually rigorous thinker, he actively engaged with the philosophical and scientific debates of his era. His challenge to the supremacy of reason was itself rooted in rational argument, but he believed that reason must be complemented by faith, emotion, and spiritual insight. To flourish, human beings require the integration of all aspects of their nature. Reason, when severed from faith, tends to become cold, rigid, and even harmful. Faith, if detached from reason, risks devolving into dogma or blind superstition. But when reason is illuminated by faith and anchored in a spiritual understanding of reality, it becomes a force for genuine human growth. This is why Dostoevsky placed such profound importance on suffering as a catalyst for personal transformation. Pain has the power to dismantle our arrogance and compel us to acknowledge truths that intellect alone cannot grasp. Through suffering, we become receptive to grace, redemption, and the possibility of inner renewal. It fosters humility, nurtures compassion, and draws us closer to the unfathomable depths of existence. These are realms that rational thought is incapable of fully reaching. Someone who has never endured profound suffering may continue to believe that intellect and will are sufficient to control life. But one who has been shattered by suffering and later restored by grace comes to recognize that reality transcends the boundaries of any purely rational framework. Part 8. The Psychology of the Unconscious and Human Motivation. Long before Sigmund Freud introduced the world to psychoanalysis, Fyodor Dostoevsky had already charted the hidden landscapes of the human psyche with remarkable depth and clarity. His literary work served not merely as fiction, but as profound psychological case studies, illuminating the covert impulses, suppressed desires, and internal struggles that lie beneath the surface of human behavior. Freud himself recognized Dostoevsky's pioneering contributions to psychological understanding, placing him second only to Shakespeare in literary significance. Freud even acknowledged that many foundational ideas in psychoanalysis had already been foreshadowed in Dostoevsky's writing. What set Dostoevsky apart, however, was not theoretical speculation, but his acute and first-hand observation of human behavior under the most extreme and revealing conditions. Dostoevsky grasped a fundamental truth. Human actions are often governed by forces beyond conscious awareness. People seldom behave in accordance with the reasons they consciously offer. More often, their real motives lie in stark opposition to their stated beliefs or rational justifications. For instance, Raskolnikov convinces himself that his crime is a selfless act to aid the poor and validate a philosophical theory about exceptional individuals. In truth, his actions are driven by a deep-seated need to assert dominance and compensate for his feelings of inferiority. Similarly, the underground man insists he isolates himself because others are beneath him, but his detachment stems from a profound fear of rejection and an inability to risk genuine emotional vulnerability. Ivan Karamazov constructs complex arguments against the existence of God, yet his atheism is rooted not in logic, but in emotional torment, his refusal to accept a world in which innocent children endure suffering. In each of these examples, the conscious rationale serves not to reveal, but to obscure the deeper psychological truths. Dostoevsky's insight into the fractured and often contradictory nature of human motivation was nothing short of revolutionary. If individuals lack awareness of their true motives, then rational persuasion and moral instruction are largely ineffective tools for changing behavior. If unconscious impulses exert greater influence than conscious intention, then reform strategies based solely on logic or self-interest are destined to fail. Furthermore, if inner conflicts operate beyond the reach of voluntary control, then traditional models of justice and moral education must be fundamentally rethought. Dostoevsky's unflinching psychological realism upended the prevailing notions of his era, and it continues to challenge widely held beliefs about human nature today. One of Dostoevsky's greatest intellectual feats was his intuitive grasp of what modern psychology would later term defense mechanisms, the unconscious strategies people employ to shield themselves from painful truths about who they are and the reality they face. He depicted rationalization as a process by which individuals invent logical justifications for behavior actually driven by irrational emotional needs. Through projection, his characters deflect their own forbidden impulses by attributing them to others, thereby avoiding self-confrontation. Denial enables them to ignore glaring facts that would otherwise demand a painful reevaluation of their self-image or behavior. In compensation, they attempt to excel in one area to offset inadequacies in another, and through sublimation, they transform socially unacceptable urges into constructive or creative outlets. Dostoevsky portrayed these defense mechanisms with such psychological precision that it would take decades for formal psychology to catch up. His characters do not simply reflect theoretical constructs. They live out the deepest truths of the human mind, long before those truths had names. The underground man stands as one of the most psychologically intricate figures in all of literature, precisely because he embodies both the analyst and the subject being analyzed. He possesses a clear and penetrating awareness of his own psychological defenses. However, this insight offers him no liberation from their grip. He fully recognizes that his resentment lacks rational basis, that his worldview is crafted to justify his own behavior, and that his isolation is a choice he himself has made. Yet, rather than providing clarity or relief, This self-knowledge intensifies his torment. He becomes ensnared in an infinite regress of self-examination, where he scrutinizes not only his thoughts, but the very process of his thinking, until any distinction between genuine understanding and self-deception vanishes. This reveals a powerful truth about the limitations of self-awareness as a method for healing. Awareness of one's psychological patterns alone is insufficient to bring about change, and in fact, too much introspection can spiral into a pathological state of mind. Dostoevsky also foresaw many contemporary insights into how early psychological trauma shapes adult behavior. Numerous characters in his works bear the lasting scars of childhood neglect, abuse, or abandonment, wounds that echo throughout their adult lives, influencing their relationships and decisions. For instance, Smirdyakhov's deep-seated hatred and eventual violence are rooted in his origins as an illegitimate child, forever marginalized by both his father and society. Nastasia Filipovna's pattern of self-destruction in The Idiot is a direct consequence of the psychological damage caused by sexual abuse during her youth. The underground man's hypersensitivity and bitterness likewise stem from formative experiences of rejection and humiliation. However, Dostoevsky never allows trauma to serve as an all-encompassing justification for his characters' actions. To do so would strip them of moral agency and nullify the potential for redemption. In his view, trauma may exert a powerful influence, but it does not dictate destiny. Human beings remain capable of overcoming their conditioning through acts of spiritual renewal and conscious moral choice. Among Dostoevsky's most profound psychological contributions is his exploration of guilt and conscience as central forces driving human behavior. Many of his protagonists wrestle with unconscious guilt over sins, real or imagined, which reveals itself through various forms of self-inflicted suffering and sabotage. Raskolnikov's deteriorating health and eventual confession are not the result of a change in ideology, but of his inability to psychologically cope with the burden of murder, despite his intellectual belief that it was justified. The underground man's misery and self-imposed exile are also expressions of internal punishment for his failures, both moral and social. Even Karamazov's descent into madness illustrates his subconscious guilt over a patricide he did not physically commit, but nonetheless feels responsible for. These characters show that conscience operates as a powerful, autonomous psychological force, impervious to rationalization or philosophical dissection. No matter how sophisticated one's thinking, the internal moral compass cannot simply be silenced. At the same time, Dostoevsky recognizes that guilt, when taken to extremes, can become corrosive rather than redemptive. An overwhelming sense of guilt may paralyze the individual, foster intense self-loathing, and block the path to forgiveness or personal growth. Some characters become so entangled in their guilt that they can no longer engage in meaningful relationships or take constructive action. Their suffering becomes compulsive, a way to appease an unforgiving internal judge, yet this suffering brings no real healing or transformation. Dostoevsky's ultimate message is that true redemption does not come from erasing guilt, but from transforming it through grace, repentance, and the willingness to change. This perspective foreshadows modern therapeutic frameworks that distinguish between healthy guilt, which fosters moral accountability, and neurotic guilt, which is a symptom of mental illness guilt, which impairs mental health and emotional resilience. Dostoevsky's exploration of love and sexuality was remarkably insightful and far ahead of his era. He perceived romantic relationships not merely as expressions of affection, but as complex psychological phenomena often driven by projection, fantasies, and the unconscious desire to resolve personal inner conflicts through another person. Figures like Nastasia Filipovna and Grushenka are not cherished for their authentic selves, but for the symbolic roles they play in the emotional and psychological lives of those who desire them. Prince Myshkin's devotion to Nastasia is rooted in more than affection. It reflects his internal need to redeem someone, thereby assigning purpose to his own suffering. Similarly, Dmitry Karamazov's infatuation with Grushenka can be seen as an unconscious quest for maternal validation and emotional acceptance. These romantic entanglements are layered with psychological intricacy, rather than being mere matters of the heart, as they embody a convergence of unresolved emotional needs and inner turmoil. In addition to his insights on love, Dostoevsky anticipated major psychological theories regarding power and dominance, ideas later refined by thinkers such as Nietzsche and Adler. Many of his characters are driven by what would now be termed a will to power, a compulsive need to assert dominance over others and their surroundings as a way of compensating for deep-seated insecurity or vulnerability. Raskolnikov's philosophy of the extraordinary man serves as a justification for his underlying desire to feel superior to the masses. The underground man's intellectualism functions as a defense mechanism, a way to assert control over those he perceives as lacking his depth of thought. Even Karamazov's atheistic arguments, while philosophical on the surface, are also a vehicle for distancing himself from the authority of a higher power. In each case, intellectual or spiritual positions are shown to be susceptible to hidden psychological motives related to control and dominance. Perhaps Dostoevsky's most striking psychological insight lies in his understanding of the role suffering plays in human development. He recognized that individuals often seek out suffering unconsciously, drawn to it not out of masochism, but because it serves profound psychological purposes that pleasure and contentment cannot fulfill. Suffering can affirm a person's belief that they are exceptional or uniquely burdened. It may also infuse a life that feels meaningless with a sense of purpose. For some, it acts as a form of self-inflicted punishment, a way to cope with guilt and reduce inner conflict. Suffering can forge emotional connections with others who have endured similar pain, creating solidarity and empathy. Moreover, it often serves as a powerful trigger for spiritual and psychological transformation that might never occur in the absence of hardship. Dostoevsky's framing of suffering as psychologically purposeful, rather than purely destructive, was revolutionary, and it remains a controversial idea even today. What makes Dostoevsky's psychological insights even more remarkable is that they were not confined to abstract theory. They were deeply experiential, even therapeutic. His novels operate as a form of emotional and psychological catharsis, allowing readers to confront and recognize aspects of themselves through his characters' struggles. By seeing their own internal conflicts reflected with brutal honesty and compassion, readers are invited to accept parts of themselves they might otherwise reject or suppress. Through witnessing characters who attain redemption and transformation despite their inner chaos and pain, readers are offered a sense of hope for their own capacity to heal and grow. Dostoevsky's stories deliver what modern psychology would term corrective emotional experiences, narratives that help people break free from self-destructive patterns and move toward psychological wholeness. This therapeutic element of his work goes a long way in explaining why his novels continue to resonate so powerfully, even more than a century after their publication. Part 9. Rejecting the West and Returning to the Native Soil. Fyodor Dostoevsky believed that the course of Western European civilization was steering humanity toward a spiritual disaster. In his view, Russia's only hope of salvation lay in turning away from imported Western ideologies and rediscovering its indigenous spiritual and cultural foundations. This belief was not a product of mere patriotic bias, but the outcome of a deeply considered philosophical stance. His position stemmed from a critical examination of what he regarded as core flaws within Western intellectual traditions, and the inevitable results of those flaws. According to Dostoevsky, the West had embraced rational materialism, personal autonomy, and technological advancement, but at the cost of spiritual richness, communal harmony, and a sense of transcendent purpose. In choosing this trajectory, Western societies became materially affluent yet spiritually barren, technologically sophisticated yet morally disoriented, and individually liberated yet socially fragmented. Dostoevsky believed that Russia could avoid falling into this same existential abyss only by deliberately choosing a different course, one grounded in Orthodox Christianity, the moral fabric of traditional peasant life, and what he termed a return to the soil. His critique of Western civilization was sweeping and unsparing. He believed that Western Christianity had been tainted by its entanglement with political power and its surrender to intellectual rationalism. Both Catholicism and Protestantism, in his view, had sacrificed the mystical, inward-facing essence of true Christianity in favor of political ambition and academic legitimacy. Philosophically, the West had abandoned its pursuit of ultimate truth, replacing it with skeptical inquiry and scientific atomization. Politically, it had dismantled organic communal structures, erecting in their place artificial frameworks based on abstract contracts and bureaucratic mechanisms. Economically, it had commodified every aspect of human life, reducing relationships to transactions and turning all things into goods for sale. What emerged from this transformation was a civilization dazzling in its technical achievements, but hollow at its spiritual core. At the root of this civilizational failure, Dostoevsky saw a profound misconception: the belief that human reason alone could solve every problem and construct ideal societies without reference to divine authority or transcendent truth. This confidence in reason had led Western philosophers and political theorists to design elaborate systems that disregarded the irrational, mysterious dimensions of the human soul. They assumed that individuals were inherently rational beings who, if properly educated and placed in favorable environments, would naturally pursue what was best for them. They believed that society could be engineered through logical principles to eliminate conflict and guarantee universal well-being. They trusted that scientific progress would eventually offer solutions to every meaningful question and resolve all of humanity's major dilemmas. Though these assumptions appeared enlightened and optimistic, Dostoevsky saw them as dangerously naive. In his eyes, they were illusions that would inevitably culminate in new forms of despotism and spiritual ruin. As an alternative, Dostoevsky proposed a return to the native soil, a deliberate reaffirmation of traditional Russian beliefs and lifestyles, especially those preserved by the rural peasantry despite centuries of Western influence among the elite. To him, the soil was not simply a metaphor for agriculture or rural existence, but a symbol of an entire worldview rooted in spiritual and communal values that stood in direct opposition to Western rationalism and individualism. Among these values were sobornost, a mystical sense of collective unity within the Orthodox Christian faith; conciliarity, the practice of reaching decisions through spiritual consensus rather than cold logic; humility, the awareness of human limitations and the recognition that true wisdom flows from God, not intellect; and suffering love, the willingness to embrace the suffering of others as a sacred path to spiritual growth and redemption. These ideals, Dostoevsky believed, had endured most purely among the Russian peasantry, who remained closely tied to the traditions of orthodoxy and untouched by the secular intellectual trends of the aristocracy and intelligentsia. His admiration for the Russian peasantry was not purely theoretical. It was deeply personal, shaped by his years of imprisonment in Siberia. Expecting to encounter nothing but cruelty and degradation among the inmates, he was instead profoundly moved by the spiritual strength and moral intuition displayed by many of the common criminals. He found among them a kind of soulful integrity and inner nobility that he rarely saw in the cultivated circles of educated society. They demonstrated remarkable acts of compassion and selflessness, even while enduring extremely harsh and unforgiving conditions. Despite living in circumstances that could easily lead to despair, they held firmly to their religious beliefs. They upheld enduring values, devotion to family, personal integrity, and a strong sense of community that had largely been weakened or dismissed by intellectuals influenced by the West. Most significantly, they had not lost their ability to experience sincere repentance or undergo deep spiritual transformation. Their suffering had refined and deepened their humanity, whereas the privilege and education of the elite often led to increased selfishness and spiritual emptiness. This realization led Dostoevsky to the profound conviction that the Russian people possessed a distinctive spiritual insight, one capable of rescuing not only Russia, but the entire world from the growing spiritual vacuum of modern times. While Western societies were drifting toward materialism, secularism, and social disintegration, Russia had retained a genuine Christian vision of human nature and the structure of society. Russian Orthodoxy had preserved the mystical and contemplative elements of faith that Western Christianity had gradually abandoned. The culture of the Russian peasantry had maintained communal ethics and ways of life that Western individualism had eroded. Meanwhile, Russian literature and the arts gave voice to spiritual truths that Western rationalist frameworks were unable to grasp. If Russia could resist the allure of Western imitation and instead evolve in accordance with its own spiritual traditions, it could become a guiding light for the rest of the world. However, Dostoevsky's belief in Russia's redemptive mission was tempered by a clear-eyed awareness of the profound Westernization that had already taken root within Russian society. For generations, the aristocracy had emulated Western European norms, losing touch with their own spiritual and cultural foundations. Russian intellectuals, in many cases, were even more extreme in their adoption of radical Western ideologies than their European counterparts. Institutions across Russia increasingly mirrored Western structures, rather than being grounded in traditional Orthodox ideals. Even the Russian Orthodox Church had adopted Western theological approaches, compromising its original spiritual integrity. A return to the land and to Russian roots would not be possible through mere rejection of the foreign. It demanded a deep and deliberate spiritual revival that would reconnect Russia with its foundational truths. Such a spiritual renewal called for a thorough transformation of Russia's education system, cultural life, and social structures. Instead of imitating the curricula of Western universities or promoting Western philosophies, Russian educational institutions should prioritize Orthodox theology, classical Russian literature, and the timeless wisdom found in peasant traditions. Rather than duplicating Western-style political and social institutions, Russia ought to develop systems of governance and community life based on Orthodox principles, emphasizing humility, collective decision-making, and spiritual purpose. In place of Western models of economic progress, Russia should cultivate an economy rooted in mutual support, shared ownership, and values that prioritize spiritual well-being over material gain. This shift would not come easily, as it required the educated elites to relinquish their privileged status and humbly learn from those they had long regarded as inferior. Yet this sacrifice was essential if Russia was to realize its destiny as a spiritual beacon for humanity. For Dostoevsky, this mission was not simply a cultural choice, it was an existential imperative. The Western trajectory, driven by rationalism and materialism, was propelling mankind toward a spiritual collapse, one that threatened to strip human life of its deepest meaning. Without intervention, this path would erode humanity's very capacity for authentic love, true faith, and moral responsibility. They would evolve into refined creatures, driven by the pursuit of pleasure and the avoidance of suffering, yet fundamentally bound by their biological instincts. Scientific knowledge and technological capabilities would grow, but this progress would come at the cost of diminishing the essence of what it means to be human. Society would become increasingly organized and efficient, but the inner lives of individuals, their souls, would grow hollow, diminished, and degraded. The ultimate outcome would be a civilization that excelled in technical prowess, yet was bereft of spiritual vitality. Only a society founded on the enduring principles of Orthodox Christianity could reverse this descent and re-establish a meaningful connection between humanity and the transcendent. Such a civilization would not reject scientific and technological advancements, but rather place them in the service of higher spiritual objectives, ensuring they remained tools, not ultimate purposes. Individual freedom would not be extinguished. Instead, it would be redefined and rooted in spiritual truths rather than in materialist ideologies. Progress would not be measured by economic gains or material accumulation, but by the growth of the soul and the deepening of spiritual insight. This reimagined modernity would harmonize innovation with the wisdom of tradition, forging a path forward that embraced both the present and the eternal. This, Dostoevsky believed, was Russia's divine calling, to demonstrate to the world that it was indeed possible to be both modern and profoundly spiritual, to possess technological mastery while remaining anchored in moral integrity. Yet Dostoevsky also acknowledged the fragility of this mission. Russia could fall prey to the very Western influences it was meant to counterbalance, thereby forfeiting its distinctive spiritual identity. The Russian people might opt for comfort over conscience, choose intellectual sophistication at the expense of mystical understanding, and prioritize individualism over communal unity. Should that happen, Russia would lose its uniqueness and become indistinguishable from the Western world. And with that loss, humanity's final hope for spiritual revival would vanish. The world would then march relentlessly toward the spiritual collapse Dostoevsky saw as the inevitable outcome of unchecked Western modernity. The choice was absolute. Either Russia would fulfill its sacred destiny and lead a global spiritual renewal, or the world would descend irreversibly into materialism and soul death. This vision of Russia's historical role was at once profoundly uplifting and deeply perilous. It offered a compelling sense of purpose that helped many Russians preserve their cultural and spiritual identity in the face of Western-driven modernization and cultural assimilation. Yet, it also gave rise to a dangerous form of nationalist self-righteousness, one capable of justifying virtually any action under the banner of Russia's spiritual mission. If Russia were truly chosen to redeem the world, then advancing Russian interests could be equated with advancing the good of all humanity. If Orthodox Christianity were seen as the sole authentic form of the faith, then alternative Christian traditions could be dismissed as heresies worthy of eradication. If Russian culture were deemed spiritually superior to that of the West, then it would follow that Russians had both the authority and the duty to impose their values on others, ostensibly for their benefit. Thus, the very vision capable of inspiring profound spiritual awakening could also be weaponized to legitimize imperialism, religious intolerance, and cultural domination. Part 10. The Eternal Struggle, Faith, Suffering, and Dostoevsky's Vision for Humanity. At the heart of Dostoevsky's philosophical worldview is a relentless tension between belief and skepticism, one that defies resolution through logic or empirical inquiry. Interwoven with this is his radical conviction that suffering is not merely incidental to the human experience, but essential, serving as the very mechanism by which individuals attain spiritual depth and a sense of true purpose. These two revelations form the cornerstone of Dostoevsky's lasting philosophical and literary impact. They represent not just a theoretical framework, but a prophetic insight into the nature of the human condition. This conflict is far more than a debate over the existence of a divine being. It is an existential dilemma that permeates every dimension of life. Suffering, in his view, is not a misfortune to be eradicated, but the forge through which the soul is purified and made whole. Together, these ideas constitute a worldview that is both profoundly unsettling and deeply salvific. Dostoevsky's own life stands as a testament to the themes he explored in his writing. Arrested, imprisoned, and exiled to Siberia, he endured physical and psychological torment that severely challenged his faith. Yet it was through this crucible of anguish that he came to see suffering as a transformative force. During his time among fellow prisoners, he encountered brutalities that seemed to contradict any belief in a benevolent God. Still, he also witnessed how certain individuals, when they bore their suffering without descending into bitterness, cultivated remarkable qualities, compassion, wisdom, and moral insight that could not have emerged otherwise. This experience led him to believe that the most profound expressions of empathy, spiritual insight, and moral clarity are not born from comfort or ease, but from enduring deep, unresolved pain. The Dostoevsky who returned from exile was neither a naive believer nor a disillusioned atheist. He had become something more nuanced, a man whose faith had been shaken by doubt and reshaped by suffering into something far more resilient and profound. This intricate interplay of belief, skepticism, and suffering finds its most vivid expression in Dostoevsky's major characters. Ivan Karamazov stands as one of literature's most eloquent advocates for atheism, not based on science, but rooted in moral outrage. Ivan cannot reconcile the idea of a just God with the suffering of innocent children, and so he rejects divine authority on ethical grounds. Ivan's rejection is impervious to theological counterarguments because it stems from a deep moral indictment of the world itself. Yet Dostoevsky demonstrates that Ivan's position, while morally charged, ultimately unravels into relativism and despair. Without a higher moral anchor, Ivan's protest against injustice collapses under its own weight, rendering moral action hollow. In stark contrast to Ivan is his brother Alyosha, who chooses to trust in divine goodness despite the evidence against it. This leap of faith transforms his relationship with life itself, enabling him to act with immediate love and grace rather than paralysis and despair. Dostoevsky's doctrine of redemptive suffering is perhaps most fully realized in figures like Sonia Marmeladova and Father Zosima. Sonia retains her inner sanctity despite living in moral degradation. Her suffering enlarges her capacity for love and forgiveness, allowing her to recognize the sacred even in someone as lost as Raskolnikov. Zosima teaches that each person shares responsibility for the pain of others, and that genuine spiritual awakening comes only when this burden is fully embraced. For Sonia, suffering becomes a path to divine understanding. For Zosima, it becomes a medium through which spiritual insight and grace flow into the world. But Dostoevsky does not idealize suffering uncritically. He is equally clear-eyed about its destructive potential. Pain, he shows us, can also corrode the soul rather than refine it. The underground man, consumed by his grievances, becomes spiteful and withdrawn. Ivan's relentless questioning drives him into a moral rebellion against the very idea of God. Smirdyakov, shaped by neglect and cruelty, becomes a murderer. What distinguishes redemptive suffering from destructive suffering is not the severity of pain, but the spirit in which it is endured. In Dostoevsky's universe, suffering is unavoidable, but how one responds to it determines whether it becomes a path to ruin or a gateway to redemption. Redemptive suffering, as Dostoevsky portrays it, demands what he refers to as active love, a deep, deliberate willingness to endure not only one's own pain, but also the pain carried by others. This goes far beyond passive empathy. It calls for a tangible, sacrificial engagement with the suffering of those around us, even at the cost of intensifying our own hardship. Such profound love is only possible in those who have come to terms with their own suffering without allowing it to fester into bitterness. Those capable of this response transmute their pain into understanding and their anguish into compassion. Prince Mishkin, with his childlike purity and Christ-like openness to suffering, exemplifies this ideal. Yet his very virtue renders him powerless in a world unwilling, or perhaps unable, to accept a love that asks for nothing in return. Still, Dostoevsky intimates that even the most seemingly futile acts of redemptive love do not vanish without impact. They sow invisible seeds of grace, destined to take root in ways that transcend immediate outcomes, operating on a spiritual plane rather than a purely pragmatic one. Dostoevsky's vision is shaped by the tension between faith and doubt, and by his conviction that suffering holds the power to transform. Long before the emergence of totalitarian regimes, he foresaw with chilling accuracy how radical ideologies would mutate into systems of mass control and dehumanization. In The Grand Inquisitor, he imagines a society built upon bread, miracles, and authority, a vision that eerily prefigures the allure of fascist and communist states. These regimes promised security and freedom from existential responsibility, drawing in millions with seductive simplicity. Through his novels, Dostoevsky revealed how the highest ideals, intellectual brilliance, humanitarian concern, could be twisted into tools of violence and tyranny. He made it clear that the gravest atrocities often emerge not from ignorance or malice, but from the zeal of educated idealists who are convinced they are saving humanity. His political foresight remains essential for grasping today's ongoing threats to liberty and human dignity. Equally enduring are Dostoevsky's insights into the human psyche. His penetrating studies of the unconscious, the fractured self, and the hidden motives behind behavior anticipated key psychological theories by decades. He recognized how excessive self-awareness can cripple one's ability to act, an affliction that afflicts countless individuals in the modern world who know what is right, yet feel unable to follow through. His accounts of how early trauma, isolation, and spiritual desolation lead to inner turmoil remain more incisive than many contemporary models. Most crucially, Dostoevsky argued that true psychological healing cannot occur without spiritual renewal, a message that continues to offer hope to those left unhelped by purely clinical or secular approaches. As secular culture continues to struggle with questions of meaning, the spiritual core of Dostoevsky's work has only grown in relevance. His foresight that abandoning religious faith would open the door to nihilism and moral ambiguity has played out across societies that have tried to construct meaning without transcendence. He understood that human beings are not wired to live without a sense of higher purpose, which is why secular ideologies so often mimic religion, offering dogmas, rituals, and demands for unquestioning loyalty. For Dostoevsky, faith is not an intellectual conclusion reached by reasoned argument, but an existential commitment made in the face of doubt, a deliberate choice to believe in meaning even when circumstances seem to refute it. At the heart of Dostoevsky's enduring legacy is his unrelenting honesty about the complexity and hardship of human life, paired with a profound hope in the possibility of transformation. He never resorted to simplistic answers or hollow comfort. Instead, he gave voice to the strongest critiques of his own worldview, crafting characters whose intelligence and moral depth rivaled those who defended the beliefs he most valued. He understood that the conflicts between belief and skepticism, liberty and safety, affection and dominance cannot be settled solely through logic or reason. Instead, they demand profound personal choices about how one interprets the inherently ambiguous nature of human experience. It is this intellectual integrity that gives his affirmations their weight, because they arise not from blind optimism, but from a hard-won engagement with despair and uncertainty. Dostoevsky's portrayal of humanity is both bleak and inspiring. He saw with brutal clarity that people are capable of immense cruelty, and that the forward march of society does not guarantee moral growth. He foresaw that as traditional frameworks of meaning eroded, individuals would face profound psychological crises that neither rational thought nor reformist politics could fully resolve. He anticipated that utopian efforts to build ideal societies through purely human means would end not in paradise, but in despotism and the annihilation of all that gives life value. And yet, he also believed in the human capacity for spiritual rebirth. Through inner transformation and redemptive love, we can reach extraordinary levels of compassion and insight, verging on the divine. In his most powerful characters, Dostoevsky illustrated that even those who have fallen into moral ruin can be restored through sincere repentance and the acceptance of grace. The fundamental decision he poses to us remains just as urgent today as it was in 19th century Russia. We can follow the path of the Grand Inquisitor, trading our freedom for comfort and control, even if it means surrendering our humanity. We can walk Ivan Karamazov's road, refusing to accept any reality that does not conform to our moral ideals, and ultimately rejecting the world itself. We can withdraw like the underground man, choosing isolation and cynicism as a form of protest against an absurd and indifferent world. Or we can embrace the path Dostoevsky saw in Christ, taking on the burden of freedom and responsibility, while placing our faith in the transformative power of love and redemption. This choice is not a one-time decision, but a continual act, one that shapes not only our personal destiny, but the future of humanity as a whole. In a time like ours, when old systems of meaning are rapidly dissolving and emerging powers threaten individual liberty, Dostoevsky's insights are more vital than ever. His critique of utopian ideologies speaks directly to today's movements that promise salvation through perfect ideologies or flawless systems. His exploration of psychological control eerily foreshadows the advanced techniques of manipulation that define modern mass culture. His recognition that spiritual emptiness breeds despair helps illuminate why even wealthy societies are haunted by widespread depression and rising suicide rates, and his belief in love as the deepest truth of existence provides the only viable path forward in a world increasingly torn by hate and division. The enduring message of Dostoevsky's philosophical legacy is as demanding as it is uplifting. It challenges us to let go of comforting lies about who we are and to confront the full, often painful, complexity of life. It asks us to act with responsibility in a world where certainty is elusive. It calls us to extend love, even when that love is not reciprocated, to offer forgiveness when it seems undeserved, and to cling to hope in moments when hope feels futile. And yet, it is encouraging, because it affirms that human beings can rise beyond their flaws and limitations to achieve a form of consciousness and moral growth that gives purpose to suffering. It offers hope by showing that even in the most desperate conditions, human dignity and the chance for redemption can survive. And it reassures us that love, truth, and spiritual meaning ultimately surpass hatred, falsehood, and brute force, even when their triumph is not immediately visible. Dostoevsky's philosophy does not offer simple solutions. Instead, it gives us something far more profound, a powerful vision of what humanity can become when we confront, rather than escape, the full depth of our condition. His work reveals that the essence of life is not found in the absence of suffering, but in the alchemy of transforming that suffering into love. True freedom, according to Dostoevsky, is not achieved by stripping away all limitations, but by deliberately choosing to dedicate ourselves to something greater than our own desires. Faith, in his view, is not the elimination of doubt, but the courageous act of believing in deeper meaning even when the evidence seems to contradict it. These ideas remain just as radical and relevant now as they were when he first expressed them, offering hope and direction to anyone seeking a genuine life in a world that often discourages such aspirations. The brilliance of Fyodor Dostoevsky's mind holds truths that humanity is still striving to grasp. His legacy calls us to confront life without illusions, to nurture hope without falling into naivete, to love without demands, and to accept responsibility without excuses. He urges us to embrace freedom fully, with all its challenges and costs. This is not an easy journey. In fact, it may be the hardest one we can take. Yet it is also the only path that leads to true purpose and authentic fulfillment. Those who choose to walk it become part of a timeless fellowship, a communion of souls bound not by circumstance, but by their shared devotion to truth, to love, and to the never-ending pursuit of becoming more deeply and fully human. This is Dostoevsky's greatest gift to us, not a rigid system of thought or a set of tidy conclusions, but a luminous vision of our highest potential, a call to live with bravery, integrity, and compassion amid life's enduring mysteries. Part 11. The Psychology of Evil and the Darkness Within. One of Dostoevsky's most unsettling insights was his belief that evil is not primarily the result of ignorance, poor social conditions, or external pressures. Rather, he concluded that evil originates from within the human heart itself. This idea was both groundbreaking and deeply controversial during the 19th century. At that time, many leading intellectuals held the view that human beings were inherently good, and that immoral behavior stemmed from flawed social systems. According to this optimistic outlook, improving education, alleviating poverty, and reforming institutions would eventually eliminate crime and moral decay. But Dostoevsky, having witnessed the raw, unfiltered side of human nature, could not accept such a hopeful perspective. His experience told him that evil was far more complex, persistent, and deeply embedded than reformers were willing to acknowledge. Dostoevsky's understanding of evil was deeply influenced by his years in a Siberian labor camp, where he lived among thieves, murderers, and hardened criminals. He arrived there expecting to find men who had turned to crime out of desperation or lack of opportunity. Instead, he encountered individuals who had chosen their actions freely, and in some cases, with alarming enthusiasm. Some prisoners appeared to find pleasure in acts of violence. Others committed heinous crimes as a way of asserting their independence or rebelling against authority. Still others seemed driven by a desire to explore the darkest boundaries of human behavior, to deliberately step beyond the line that separates civilization from savagery. What unsettled Dostoevsky most wasn't the evil acts themselves, but the humanity of those who committed them. These were not inhuman monsters. They were ordinary people with the same fundamental mental and emotional faculties as anyone else. They could reason, feel, and even grasp moral truths. just like law-abiding citizens. Some were intelligent, others charismatic. A few were even capable of real kindness in certain situations, yet they had made deliberate, defining choices that led them down terrifying paths. For Dostoevsky, this meant that the potential for darkness lies not just in a few twisted individuals, but within us all. This realization forced him to face a difficult and disturbing truth about human nature. People are not born as blank slates, shaped entirely by their environments, nor are we purely rational beings who consistently choose what is in our best interest. Instead, we are intricate, often contradictory creatures, capable of noble actions, but also of true malevolence. Within every person lies the potential for both sanctity and depravity. The direction we take in life is determined less by our circumstances and more by the moral choices we make in the deepest recesses of our being. Nowhere is this idea more vividly portrayed than in Dostoevsky's novel Crime and Punishment, through the character of Raskolnikov. He is a bright, thoughtful young man from a respectable background. Well-educated and sympathetic to modern social ideals, Raskolnikov is not driven to commit murder by absolute need, though hardship plays a part. Instead, he deliberately chooses to kill, hoping to prove that he is an exceptional individual, someone who stands above conventional moral codes. He convinces himself, through elaborate reasoning, that murdering a greedy old pawnbroker and distributing her wealth to the needy would be a justified, even noble, act. But Dostoevsky reveals that these intellectual arguments are little more than intricate self-justifications. The true source of Raskolnikov's crime is not philosophical, it is psychological. What he seeks more than anything is the experience of asserting his will in its most extreme form. He craves the proof that he is not bound by the same moral constraints as everyone else. He longs to feel the absolute power of life and death in his own hands. In the end, his actions are not about serving the greater good or uplifting the poor. They are about feeding his ego and fulfilling a deeply personal dark psychological urge. What makes Raskolnikov so unsettling is that his psychological makeup closely resembles that of many intellectuals and political idealists. Countless atrocities have been committed under the banner of serving humanity. Revolutionary figures throughout history have often defended acts of violence and terror as necessary sacrifices for a supposedly greater good. Many ideologues have mistaken their personal frustrations and lust for power as principled devotion to justice and social advancement. Raskolnikov exemplifies the perilous mix of intellectual brilliance and ethical blindness that underlies many modern ideological movements. He serves as a chilling model of the educated individual who employs logical reasoning to legitimize actions that are, at their core, irrational and morally abhorrent. Dostoevsky also grasped a deeper truth, that evil doesn't usually erupt from a single catastrophic lapse, but rather creeps in through a slow decline and a series of moral concessions. Rarely does someone consciously decide one morning to become a criminal or a despot. More often, people take a succession of small ethical shortcuts that gradually corrode their ability to distinguish right from wrong. They begin with harmless-seeming deceptions that lay the groundwork for larger lies. They excuse minor selfish acts that eventually make room for much greater acts of self-interest. They dismiss minor injustices until they're capable of tolerating and even participating in grave ones. These seemingly insignificant compromises accumulate, numbing the conscience and paving the way for deeply immoral behavior. This gradual moral decay is masterfully depicted in the brothers Karamazov through the character of Smerdyakov, who ultimately murders his father, Fyodor. Smerdyakov is not inherently evil, he is shaped by a morally bankrupt and hypocritical environment. He grows up surrounded by duplicity and self-indulgence, and he learns, step by step, to exploit those around him for personal gain. He adopts a philosophy rooted in nihilism and opportunism, a belief system that endorses any action as long as it serves his ends. By the time he commits the murder, he has already lost all capacity for genuine moral sentiment. The act is not an aberration, but the logical endpoint of a life shaped by spiritual decay. Yet Dostoevsky's most profound insight lies in his exploration of the link between evil and human freedom. He does not treat evil as a mere accident or a social glitch that can be corrected through better institutions or policies. Rather, he presents evil as an inherent possibility that comes with true freedom. If human beings are genuinely free to choose, then some will inevitably choose evil. The capacity to love wholeheartedly also implies the potential to hate completely. The ability to sacrifice oneself for another carries with it the dark possibility of sacrificing others for one's own benefit. In other words, freedom entails the unavoidable risk of choosing wrongly, and thus evil will always remain part of the human condition. This understanding does not suggest that we should resign ourselves to evil or stop striving to lessen suffering and injustice. However, it does challenge the belief that we can construct a flawless society or completely eliminate moral failure. Political systems that claim to eradicate evil through reform are either dangerously naive or willfully deceptive. Similarly, psychological theories that reduce evil to mere pathology or social dysfunction overlook something essential about the human spirit, and any religious or philosophical framework that tries to rationalize away authentic moral choice denies a central aspect of what it means to be truly human. Dostoevsky also saw that efforts to abolish evil often give rise to even greater evils. When people become convinced that humanity can be perfected through reason and planning, they tend to justify the use of coercion against those who resist their vision. If wrongdoing is attributed entirely to social conditions, not individual responsibility, then the blame shifts from the wrongdoer to the architects of the society itself. In such a worldview, criminals are no longer accountable for their choices and no longer deserve punishment. Instead, those who maintain the social structures deemed unjust become the true culprits. These individuals are then seen as obstacles to progress, and therefore as targets for persecution or even elimination. This logic, when fully pursued, leads to the suppression of dissent and the demonization of anyone who questions the utopian project. The result is that attempts to build a perfect world often produce societies that are far more brutal and unjust than the flawed systems they set out to replace. The characters in Demons vividly embody this tragic progression. What begins as a heartfelt concern for social injustice and a sincere commitment to uplifting the downtrodden gradually mutates into something far more sinister. As their revolutionary zeal deepens, it consumes their fundamental sense of compassion and morality. In pursuit of their ideological goals, they begin to justify deceit, theft, and even murder. They come to believe that their personal bitterness and animosity are not only justified but virtuous, that these emotions are, in fact, a courageous stand for justice. In doing so, they inflict damage far greater than the societal ills they originally set out to correct. Their crusade to eradicate evil ironically transforms them into instruments of the very darkness they aimed to destroy. For Dostoevsky, the true solution to evil is not rooted in politics or social reform, but in spiritual awakening. No system of government, no level of education or reform can eradicate evil entirely. The battle must be fought within the human soul. Each individual must recognize the seeds of evil within themselves and choose, daily, to resist them. This inner conflict is lifelong, with no promise of final triumph in this world, yet it remains the only path by which we can preserve our humanity amid the surrounding darkness, and sometimes, through sincere repentance and the mysterious workings of grace, it can give rise to authentic redemption and profound inner transformation. Part 12. The Dilemma of Innocent Suffering and Ivan's Defiance. No philosophical question haunted Dostoevsky more profoundly than the enigma of innocent suffering. How can a benevolent and omnipotent God allow children to endure unspeakable pain, to be brutalized, mistreated, and killed? How are we to maintain faith in divine justice when the world seems saturated with arbitrary cruelty and unwarranted agony? This issue strikes at the core of both religious conviction and moral philosophy. Many theologians attempt to reconcile it through doctrines of free will, appeals to a greater good, or by invoking the inscrutable nature of divine wisdom. Yet Dostoevsky, a man too intimately familiar with human suffering, could not accept such justifications. His approach was unflinching. He brought the problem into sharp relief, exposing its emotional and moral weight without softening its harsh edges. Nowhere is this moral confrontation more powerfully expressed than in the figure of Ivan Karamazov, a central character in The Brothers Karamazov. Ivan is an erudite thinker, well-versed in theology, philosophy, and history. He knows all the traditional arguments in defense of God's existence and the rationale for the presence of evil in a divinely governed world. Yet he is also deeply troubled by the documented atrocities committed against children, gruesome, real-life accounts that he has painstakingly compiled from historical records and newspaper reports. These are not hypothetical or abstract musings, but vivid, gut-wrenching narratives of young lives destroyed by adult cruelty. For Ivan, the brutal reality of these stories renders all theological explanations hollow. One case he shares with his younger brother Alyosha involves a 5-year-old girl subjected to horrific abuse by her own parents. They punished her for trivial misbehaviors by beating her, locking her overnight in an outhouse in freezing temperatures, and even forcing her to consume her own waste. The child prayed for God's help, but no help ever came. Eventually, her parents tortured her to death. Ivan puts a question to Alyosha, simple yet devastating in its implications. How can anyone make sense of a tiny, innocent child pounding her frail little fists against her chest in the cold and darkness, sobbing as she begs God to save her? And what kind of God listens to such desperate prayers and remains silent? Ivan's examples multiply, each one more harrowing than the last. In one, a general has a peasant boy torn to pieces by hunting dogs as punishment for accidentally harming one of his prized hounds. In another, Turkish soldiers in Bulgaria use infants as sport, throwing them into the air and catching them on the ends of their bayonets. Around the world, in countless homes, parents beat, starve, and sexually abuse their children, while the cries for mercy go unanswered. These are not rare or isolated events, Ivan insists, but recurring patterns of inhumanity throughout history. Every generation brings forth new tragedies that seem to mock the very idea of a just or meaningful universe. Religious responses to such suffering often suggest that God's reasons lie beyond human comprehension. Perhaps these atrocities serve some higher purpose that will be revealed after death. Perhaps they are necessary for spiritual growth or part of a divine plan that leads to a greater good. Or maybe the pain of this world will be balanced out by eternal joy in the next. Ivan finds these answers not only inadequate, but morally reprehensible. No ultimate purpose can ever justify the torment of a child. No promise of heavenly reward can erase the injustice of a child's agony. If the construction of a harmonious universe requires the blood and tears of even one innocent child, Ivan refuses to accept such a universe. His rejection is both intellectually rigorous and emotionally shattering. Ivan does not deny the existence of God outright, but he cannot reconcile himself to the world God has made. He declines to be complicit in a cosmic system that is built upon the suffering of the blameless. Even if someone could prove that all pain will one day make sense and that all wrongs will eventually be righted, Ivan still refuses to endorse such a reality. Some moral lines, he insists, should never be crossed, not for any cause, no matter how exalted. The suffering of even a single child is too high a price to pay for any vision of future redemption or universal order. No amount of promised bliss can justify that sacrifice. This perspective does not represent atheism in its conventional form. Ivan is not attempting to disprove the existence of God or challenge the factual basis of religious beliefs. Rather, his argument is grounded in moral philosophy, a direct ethical indictment of the universe itself. Even if God does exist, and even if there is a divine scheme that ultimately leads to justice, Ivan categorically refuses to give his approval to such a framework. He would prefer eternal damnation over becoming complicit in a cosmic order that permits the suffering of innocents as a means to achieve any end. His protest is not against God's reality, but against the moral legitimacy of God's justice. Ivan's defiance reaches its zenith in his renowned parable of the Grand Inquisitor. In this narrative, Jesus returns to earth during the era of the Spanish Inquisition, performing miracles and healing the afflicted. Yet, the Grand Inquisitor, symbolizing the pinnacle of ecclesiastical authority, has him imprisoned. He visits Jesus in his cell to explain why the Church must denounce and ultimately execute him. The heart of the Inquisitor's argument lies in Jesus' gift of freedom to humanity. Freedom, he claims, is a burden too immense for most people to carry. The Church, in contrast, has rectified Jesus' so-called error by offering believers security, certainty, and an escape from the overwhelming responsibility of autonomous moral choice. The Inquisitor contends that Jesus was mistaken in refusing the three temptations presented by Satan in the wilderness. The first temptation, turning stones into bread, symbolized the promise to meet humanity's basic material needs. Jesus declined, affirming that man shall not live by bread alone. But the Inquisitor counters that most human beings are not spiritually inclined enough to seek anything beyond physical sustenance. By choosing not to address hunger and poverty directly, Jesus, in the Inquisitor's view, doomed the majority of humankind to relentless suffering. A truly loving deity, he argues, would have prioritized feeding people over preserving their spiritual autonomy. The second temptation offered Jesus a chance to validate his divine nature by leaping from the temple and having angels rescue him, an act that would have proven his divinity through an undeniable miracle. Jesus rejected this, holding that genuine faith must be a matter of free will rather than the result of coerced belief. Yet the Inquisitor claims that most people crave certainty and are plagued by existential doubt. By withholding definitive proof of his divinity, Jesus left humanity adrift in an ocean of uncertainty, grappling with torturous questions about God's existence and nature. A truly compassionate God, the Inquisitor argues, would have revealed himself unmistakably, thereby alleviating the torment of doubt and granting people the peace of unquestionable truth. In the third and final temptation, Satan offered Jesus dominion over all earthly kingdoms, a chance to create a flawless political and social order. Jesus turned it down, declaring that his kingdom was not of this world. But the Inquisitor insists that humanity needs authoritative leadership and structured society in order to lead ethical, orderly lives. By declining worldly power, Jesus abandoned humanity to the chaos of war, injustice, and societal disorder. A truly wise deity, according to the Inquisitor, would have accepted political authority and used it to construct a world where all could live in justice and harmony. The Grand Inquisitor concludes that the Church has corrected Jesus' so-called missteps by embracing the very offerings he refused from Satan. Through acts of charity, the Church feeds the poor. Through doctrine and hierarchical authority, it offers certainty. And through political engagement, it establishes social stability. In doing so, the Church has made the masses far more content than they ever would have been under the spiritual freedom Jesus envisioned. According to the Inquisitor, only a rare few possess the spiritual strength to endure the radical freedom Jesus offered. For the rest of humanity, freedom is not a gift, but a burden. The Church has assumed this burden on their behalf, replacing liberty with the comfort and security that people truly desire. This parable explores the dilemma of innocent suffering in its most profound and intricate form. If God truly loves humankind, why does he allow pain and hardship to persist when he has the power to intervene? One possible explanation is that God places a higher value on human freedom than on human happiness. Yet this implies that God is prepared to let real individuals suffer in order to uphold an abstract ideal. But can such a stance genuinely be called love? Or is it a kind of cosmic cruelty disguised in the language of theology? Ivan's rebellion compels us to face a disturbing question. What if the moral structure of the universe itself is fundamentally unjust? Dostoevsky refuses to offer comforting resolutions to these agonizing issues. He presents Ivan's critiques with full philosophical rigor and emotional intensity. At the same time, he reveals the heavy psychological toll Ivan's rebellion exacts. Ivan's rejection of a world governed by God leads him down a path of nihilism and despair. If the universe is devoid of ultimate justice, then the foundation for moral truth crumbles. If there is no meaning to the suffering of the innocent, then all human efforts and aspirations lose their significance. If God is indifferent to human well-being, then perhaps nothing has any real value. Ivan's unwavering commitment to intellectual truth brings him to conclusions that render life emotionally unbearable. In contrast, Alyosha, Ivan's brother, offers another response. He embraces the mystery of innocent suffering without claiming to understand it. Alyosha lacks the theological sophistication of Ivan. He cannot explain why children endure pain, but he chooses to trust in God's goodness even when the evidence appears to contradict it. Rather than engage in theoretical argument, Alyosha meets suffering with acts of kindness and compassion. Though he cannot solve the problem of evil, he dedicates himself to easing the pain of those around him. His faith is not anchored in logic or debate, but in a personal experience of grace and spiritual transformation. Dostoevsky ultimately implies that the question of innocent suffering is not one that can be resolved through abstract reasoning. It is a reality that must be faced, endured, and responded to with love. While this does not lessen the gravity or tragedy of suffering, it offers a path through which one can hold on to both moral clarity and spiritual hope amidst the deepest uncertainties of human existence. Part 13. The Grand Inquisitor and the Dilemma between Liberty and Security. The Grand Inquisitor chapter in the Brothers Karamazov stands as one of the most profound and prophetic political parables ever crafted. Within just a few pages, Dostoevsky anticipates the emergence of totalitarian regimes, dissects the psychological allure of authoritarian power, and explores the deep-rooted conflict between the desire for freedom and the pursuit of happiness. The story is framed as a tale within a tale, narrated by Ivan Karamazov to his devout brother Alyosha. Though presented as part of Ivan's spiritual protest against God, the implications of the parable reach far beyond theological debate. It grapples with some of the most essential issues in political thought and the human condition. The narrative unfolds in 16th century Spain at the height of the Spanish Inquisition. In this imagined scenario, Jesus Christ returns to earth and walks through the streets of Seville, quietly performing miracles and offering comfort to the afflicted. The people immediately recognize him, flocking to him in awe and hope. However, the Grand Inquisitor, the supreme authority of the Catholic Church, watches the scene unfold with grave concern. Alarmed by Christ's presence and influence, the Inquisitor orders his arrest. That night, he visits Jesus in his prison cell and delivers a chilling yet meticulously reasoned monologue in which he explains why the Church must condemn and execute him once again. The Inquisitor acknowledges Jesus' divine identity and accepts the authenticity of his original teachings. However, he contends that Jesus fundamentally misunderstood human beings. Christ, he says, gave people the gift of freedom, but this gift is more curse than blessing for the majority. Most people are too weak, too fearful, and too spiritually undeveloped to bear the weight of true freedom. According to the Inquisitor, humanity seeks not liberty, but comfort and certainty. People do not want to bear the burden of personal moral responsibility or spiritual choice. Instead, they crave guidance, someone to dictate what they should believe, how they should behave, and what purpose their lives should serve. Above all, they long for security and release from the torment of decision-making. The Church, the Inquisitor claims, has rectified Christ's mistake by giving people what they truly need, rather than what he believed they ought to desire. Rather than demanding individuals make difficult moral decisions, the Church has relieved them of that task. It has assumed the burden of choice on their behalf. Where Jesus called for each soul to wrestle with faith and doubt alone, the Church has stepped in to offer firm answers to all spiritual dilemmas. Rather than leaving people in a state of moral confusion, the Church supplies unambiguous rules that eliminate uncertainty and resolve inner conflict. The result, according to the Inquisitor, is a population that is calmer, more united, and ultimately more content than they ever could have been under Christ's original vision of spiritual autonomy. To bolster his argument, the Inquisitor reinterprets the three temptations that Christ faced in the wilderness, suggesting that each one revealed something essential about human needs, and that Jesus' rejection of them exposed his flawed view of humanity. The first temptation was to turn stones into bread, symbolizing the alleviation of material deprivation and economic hardship. Jesus refused, saying that man does not live by bread alone. Yet the Inquisitor insists that this refusal doomed people to lives dominated by hunger and anxiety. Most individuals, he argues, cannot think about spiritual salvation when they are starving or destitute. Physical survival, not lofty ideals, is their foremost concern. By declining to meet this fundamental need, Jesus failed the majority of humanity, leaving them vulnerable to fear and insecurity. The second temptation was for Jesus to leap from the pinnacle of the temple and be miraculously saved by angels, an act that would have proven his divine nature beyond doubt. This represented the power to impose belief through spectacle and undeniable evidence. But Jesus refused again, maintaining that faith must be a matter of free will, not coercion through miracles. The Inquisitor challenges this, claiming that most people are haunted by spiritual doubt and desperately seek assurance. They are not equipped to live with ambiguity and crave certainty in matters of faith. Without unmistakable proof, they are left floundering in confusion and existential despair. By withholding the kind of conclusive evidence that would have made belief easy, Jesus condemned humanity to endure relentless spiritual turmoil and unanswered questions about the nature and existence of God. The third and final temptation presented to Jesus was the offer of supreme rule over all the kingdoms of the world, symbolizing the power to establish flawless political and social systems. Jesus refused this temptation as well, affirming that his kingdom was not of this world. In contrast, the Grand Inquisitor contends that most human beings require firm leadership and structured societies to live moral and stable lives. According to him, the majority are incapable of managing the chaos, conflict, and uncertainty that accompany political liberty. He argues that people need authoritarian institutions to make decisions on their behalf and to shield them from the repercussions of their own misguided choices. In rejecting the opportunity to found a utopian earthly kingdom, Jesus consigned humanity to endure war, injustice, and social unrest. The Inquisitor ultimately claims that Satan had a deeper understanding of human nature than Jesus did. Satan offered precisely what the masses truly desire and need. The gift of bread symbolizes material well-being and economic stability. Miracles stand for absolute certainty and the eradication of doubt. Authority signifies firm leadership and relief from the burden of personal moral autonomy. The Church, he says, has accepted all three of these gifts. It has built a system around them, one that, in the Inquisitor's view, provides far more happiness to the vast majority of people than Jesus' original vision ever could. He asserts that this system is actually more compassionate and loving than the one Jesus proposed. While Christ's plan might have worked for the small, spiritually resilient minority, those capable of living with freedom, uncertainty, and moral responsibility, it would have spelled disaster for the rest of humanity. Out of pity for the weak and vulnerable, the Church gave them not what they ought to want in theory, but what they truly require in practice. To accomplish this, the Church had to forfeit its own spiritual integrity. It took upon itself the heavy responsibility of making difficult decisions on behalf of others. The leaders of the Church are fully aware that they have betrayed the teachings of Christ and, in doing so, have condemned themselves. Yet they are prepared to carry this burden, motivated by their love for humankind. What makes this argument so unsettling is that it contains just enough truth to be believable. How many people genuinely desire the weight of making their own ethical and spiritual choices? How many prefer the security of stable incomes over the risks of economic freedom? How many would rather live in certainty than seek truth, especially when the two are in conflict? How many would willingly relinquish the complexities of democratic participation in favor of strong leaders who promise to handle everything? Though bleak, the Inquisitor's view of humanity is not easily dismissed. Dostoevsky wrote this allegory long before the emergence of fascist and communist regimes, yet it uncannily anticipates their appeal. These totalitarian systems offered precisely what the Grand Inquisitor described. They aimed to solve economic issues through centralized control and state planning. They promised ideological certainty, claiming to possess all the answers and to eliminate doubt. They pledged decisive leadership that would free citizens from the burden of political responsibility. And millions accepted these promises, drawn by the comfort of being freed from the demands of personal liberty. This parable also reveals why democratic systems are inherently fragile, and why freedom is always at risk. Democracies depend on citizens who are willing to educate themselves about complex problems, make hard choices, and bear the consequences of those choices. This is a demanding task, one that many would prefer to avoid. It is far easier to surrender decision-making to others and then place blame when things go wrong. It is far more reassuring to adopt fixed ideological positions than to confront life's moral ambiguities and unsolvable questions. The true allure of authoritarianism is not just about politics or economics. It is psychological. It promises escape from the heavy burden of freedom itself. Yet Dostoevsky does not allow the Inquisitor's monologue to have the final word. After silently listening to the entire speech, Jesus offers no counter-argument. He says nothing at all. Instead, he approaches the Inquisitor and softly kisses him on his withered lips. This kiss is devoid of logic or debate. It is simply an act of love for a man who has lost his way. The Inquisitor is clearly moved by Jesus' silent act of love, yet remains unwavering in his conviction. He sets Jesus free, warning him never to return. Without protest, Jesus departs quietly, and the Inquisitor resumes his solemn duty of guiding humanity according to what he believes is its best interest. This conclusion highlights the enduring conflict between liberty and security, a dilemma that cannot be conclusively settled through reason alone. Each side presents a powerful, rational case. Ultimately, the decision rests on a deeper, existential judgment about the nature of humanity and what it can aspire to. Jesus embodies a radical trust in human potential, affirming that freedom, despite its cost, is inherently valuable and necessary. In contrast, the Inquisitor reflects a kind of benevolent pragmatism, grounded in a sobering view of human weakness. He holds that most people require structure and protection, even at the expense of their autonomy. Both perspectives hold partial truths and blind spots, and the friction between them is unlikely ever to be fully resolved. Dostoevsky compels us to recognize that this dilemma is never far from us, whether we face it as individuals or as societies. We are continually presented with two diverging paths. One leads toward freedom, with all its dangers, ambiguities, and burdens. The other offers the safety of certainty, comfort, and dependence. Neither path can claim absolute moral superiority, and both demand sacrifices from those who choose them. Yet, choose we must. And whatever path we take will not only shape the course of our own lives, it will ripple outward, influencing the fate of generations to come.